And I'm going to call the August 16th, 2022 Planning Board meeting to order. And our first order of business is a roll call vote, particularly for the benefit of the public who and the participants in this hearing who are appearing via Zoom. So when I call your name, will you please indicate that you're present? And you might also identify yourself for the record as well for the Zoom. Rick Mitchell.
Rick Mitchell here.
Richard Boroff.
Richard Boroff here.
Bill Wheaton. Is he here?
Not yet.
Oh, not yet. We'll pause. We'll give Bill Wheaton just a few more minutes. So I'll continue with the roll call, but I won't proceed with the agenda until he appears. Jonathan Poor.
Jonathan Poor here.
Emil Dahlquist.
Emil Dahlquist here.
Elizabeth her is not here, and Patrick indicates that she may or may not be here. And if she does appear, she will be late. Pat Norton.
Pat Norton here.
And Corey Beaulieu.
Corey Beaulieu here.
And Marnie Crouch here. So we'll pause now and give Bill Wheaton a few minutes to appear.
Do you want to double check the attendees list? Maybe you didn't notice.
There he is.
While we're paused just a second, I would like to recognize and thank Megan Carroll for having assisted me with the Zoom component of our meetings. And I have to believe that she's probably saved most of them. And I thank her. She's going away to college later this month, and I did want to recognize and thank her for
Oh, how wonderful.
for
It looks
assisting
like
us.
you're starting high school, and that's meant as a compliment from someone my age. Maybe not from your peers, but
So I
So,
propose a round of applause.
we're in the midst of roll call. So when I call your name, Mr. Wheaton, could you indicate that you're present? Bill Wheaton?
Present.
Okay, that's wonderful. So we have a quorum, and all members are present except for Elizabeth Herr. I will indicate for the record that the members of the planning board and the associate member of the planning board who will be deliberating this evening include the following: Rick Mitchell, Richard Boroff, Bill Wheaton, Jonathan Poor, Emil Dahlquist, Marnie Crouch, and Pat Norton, who is an associate member, but he is filling in with respect to deliberating and voting on the special permit and the associated stormwater management application.
Marnie, can I just make a suggestion? Everybody needs to speak into their microphone so that the audience can hear us. They're very sensitive in terms of what they pick up or don't pick up.
Sure. So at this juncture, I'm going to take the A&R request that we have before us out of order. This A&R request is for 300 Bridge Street. Do I have to read this entire thing?
You do not.
So the proponent of the Form A, approval not required, if you're present via Zoom, would you please make yourself known and give us a little information about the A&R for 300 Bridge Street?
Madam Chair, if they're not available, they did discuss it with me. It's been a few weeks ago. But effectively, the desire, and you have some information, members, in your package. It is in number 2 of the package. There's actually the survey that was prepared by Hayes Company, and what's being proposed is to sell parcel B What you see is sort of a tab of property from the overall 300 Bridge Street property. Their proposal, and the clients, or rather the proponents, applicants are Bruce and Julie Kennedy. They may at some point be with us via Zoom from Santa Barbara, but what they'd like to do is sell parcel B to the owner of Sunshine Realty Trust, which you see at the easterly corner of Bridge Street and that little U-shaped drive. So what would take place is it's increasing the size of that property owned by Sunshine Realty. It would be more conforming, and 300 Bridge Street would no longer have that front piece. However, its access as well as frontage is derived from this access drive that you see in the U shape there, which is fully adequate.
How does it get access? How does it get frontage? I understand it gets access from an easement
How does it get frontage?
but how does it get frontage off of a private driveway?
They own rights within that private driveway, and A&Rs have the ability to be accessed by private driveways.
I understand that they have access, but they still need frontage.
Their frontage also,
Comes off of the Sunshine Realty Trust Square?
no, their frontage comes from that access drive that surrounds that
That's
property.
not, I don't understand how that's frontage. It's not an approved public way.
I think,
Maybe I'm misreading this?
no, I think, Patrick, he might be confused. I think he's asking about parcel B, where is it getting its frontage?
No, I'm asking, I understand parcel B gets its frontage on Bridge Street.
You're asking about parcel A?
But yes, but does parcel A lose frontage? That was the inference of all this, is that parcel A doesn't lose its frontage by selling off the land that has frontage on Bridge Street.
So, take a page.
There's a lawyer's opinion in here
Yeah.
somewhere about this, but I'm not, Marnie, do you widely held principle of real estate law that where land is conveyed with a description bounding on a way, this is or by reference to a plan which shows boundary on a way, that such land is entitled to easements. Yeah, that's true. I understand they can drive over that, but I do not understand how what is now Lot A gets frontage.
I agree with you. I don't either. I mean, I don't understand that. I don't know.
And I'm by way of extension too, if he does get frontage off of that, what's to prevent him from putting, 6 other houses along that private driveway saying the same thing, that they all get frontage from the private driveway, which I don't think they are entitled to.
What were you going to say, Patrick?
The Mass General Law allows communities, as I understand it, to allow A&R projects or A&R applications to be granted on private ways. You look at our community, east to west, north to south, about a third of our streets are private ways. The properties that are owned that abut those private ways now have access, now have frontage. So
Okay.
that's,
Because the private way connects to another street.
it illustrates the adequacy of a private way for access as well as frontage.
Patrick, I agree with you because I live on a private way and there are properties along here. But this is really easement, not so much a private way. And I'm familiar with this property, and at least where I live, even though it's a quote-unquote private way, cars can drive down it freely, and I am not sure that the easement would qualify as a private way. So the question is whether an easement is equivalent to a private
To a
way.
private way. I mean,
And I
you're
don't
right.
know.
We've approved subdivisions with private ways, but they're
Right.
paved and they have, they abide by all the features, just we don't, accept the street as a public way. But
Well,
this
we have an
is,
attorney in the room. I don't know if she would opine on that. Would you, yeah, you gotta come to the,
Good evening, everyone. Robin Stein from KP Law. I'm not actually here on this one, so I haven't seen the plan, but I can tell you what the subdivision control law says, which may be helpful to your discussion. Give me
could
one.
you speak up?
Sure. Give me
Please.
1 second, and I will quote you the subdivision control law. Okay. So, when it comes to A&Rs, the subdivision control law provides that it is not a subdivision, meaning it's eligible for A&R improvement, if, let's see, every lot that's being divided has frontage either on a public way or a way in which the clerk of the city or town certifies is maintained and used as a public way, or a way shown on a plan heretofore approved and endorsed in accordance with the subdivision control law, so a previous subdivision private way would qualify, or a way in existence when the subdivision control law became effective in the city or town in which the land lies, having, in the opinion of the planning board, sufficient width, suitable grades, and adequate construction to provide for the needs of vehicular traffic in relation to the proposed use of the land abutting thereon and served by thereby, and it goes on. And to your point, there is a difference between an easement and a laid-out way. And I don't know what's on the plan before you, because I haven't seen it or looked at it, but it needs to be on either a prior subdivision way or a pre-existing way.
It says 50-foot easement for passage.
Yeah, and we've approved A&Rs on private ways before, so
But this isn't a private way.
this is not built up. This private way
it is.
is truly not even gravel.
No, I understand.
It's a
Doesn't
dirt
matter whether
road.
it's gravel or,
Again, I don't know if it's a way as.
Could I offer some just information? My name's Michael Whitney. I was actually the one that helped procure and bring this buyer in. My understanding is, because I had gone to the town multiple times in the process of the purchase of this property, that there's 3 or 4 other houses on that right away that have no frontage. So, our whole interpretation was that this was access from 300 Bridge. It was in place for decades, and it happened right after I believe the Clarks subdivided it. So that was something I just wanted to comment on.
No, I understand that, and I agree that this frontage through this private way, which is a driveway, pre-existed our subdivision control laws. That's been there for many more than 100 years. So in that sense, I guess all the houses that are there are grandfathered, including the house that is on Lot A. However, if there were to try to be further subdivision, adding houses along that now, after the subdivision control laws are in effect, I think we would have a right to say, I'm asking town council, no, this has to be improved up to some standards matching what we have for public ways.
So again, I'm not in a position to answer that question, not having seen or knowing anything about the application, but I can tell you again that the subdivision control law says that it's not a subdivision, thus eligible for A&R approval, if it's a way in existence when the subdivision control law became effective in the city or town, and in the opinion of the planning board, has sufficient width, suitable grades, and adequate construction to
Okay.
provide for the needs of vehicular traffic in relation to the proposed use of the land abutting thereon and served by thereby, and for installation of municipal services to serve such land and the buildings erected or to be erected.
Okay.
So if it,
Then it
if
would
it's
be
a
up to us to decide whether this
suitability, yes.
facility was adequate. Okay.
I wonder, you know, how the fire department views this easement. And
You'd have to ask
whether,
them.
yeah, and whether or not there's mail delivery to the houses there or garbage pickup.
No, everything is on the street.
It's on the street, I thought.
The mail delivery is right on Bridge,
Right, it's a private road,
because everybody has a
it's
mailbox.
not a public road.
Well, I mean, I guess my view would then be that for the Lot A has not lost its frontage, because it was always getting its frontage off of the private way, which it still has. But that any future development would have to come before us, and they would not have development, it could not be an A&R. They would say, we want to do a subdivision, but we want to do it on a private way. And then we would have to look at the adequacy of this road as a subdivision.
I'm not sure I agree with that, because Lot A could decide they want to subdivide another acre off and say there's a private road and there's a grant of easement on that private way, and we have the frontage to do it.
And I don't think we can,
That decision comes after subdivision control laws have been put in place.
No, because this predates subdivision control bylaw.
All the houses there do, but any further subdivision postdates it.
well,
I don't
that
think
sounds
so.
like something that the court would have to decide, because how can you deny something to somebody when somebody else already has the same thing you're trying to deny? Doesn't make any sense to me.
Because they're grandfathered.
But no, but they may be grandfathered, but then still, you're going to have a hard time denying that to somebody, even if it is grandfathered. Because
Oh,
if it
that's the way the
exists,
law
it
works.
exists.
Lots of existing things are
I understand
grandfathered.
what you're saying, but I'm,
My question is, what are we trying, what's the point here?
I have a solution to this problem. Since the proponent of this A&R request is not here, I suggest that we continue the hearing on the A&R request to August 30th, 2022 at 7 PM, and the proponent of the request can come in and help us resolve these issues and let us know when the different properties along this easement or private way were developed, whether they were grandfathered or not. My recollection is some of these houses are
100 years
relatively
old. Oh,
new,
yes,
you know,
yes.
So
2000 or
he
something.
is actually on the call now. So he's 4,000 miles away, but he's on the call right now. And the only other one comment was, this is the only access to the property. This is the only access to 300 Bridge. But Bruce is on the call right now. Maybe you can let him in. He's on the Zoom.
I really think this is a technical, legal question. I'm not sure it's something the plaintiff would know about, but
Yeah, I don't know. You know, my recollection of this property is that there's really no traffic on that road other than the residents.
Right.
And a
They're
lot
not
of
showing
the private roads in town, they do, you know, get, you know, some traffic, just people driving by there. But my recollection is that road is quite narrow and really not conducive to any type of traffic, so.
It strikes me that the first step might be to get a legal and technical clarification of the difference between an easement and a right-of-way. And then the second piece would be to look a little bit more at Bill's logic, which I would tend to agree with. It's kind of a common sense differentiation between grandfathered and intensifying not previously, new patterns here, so.
Right.
What was the
Bruce
disposition of that
Kennedy, the
lot?
property owner, is actually on the call. Is it possible? Can you hear him? I'm actually texting with him back and forth. He's on the call now. He's actually the property owner. Can he speak? I don't know if you can hear him.
I just recognized his company name, that comes up when our attendees list soft acuity, so
Yes.
that should accommodate Bruce.
They said that you need to let him in. He's not, for some reason. Yep, okay, he's coming in now. Hey, Bruce.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I'm very sorry. I wasn't allowed into the meeting, so anyway, so I've been listening in with Michael. Michael was our broker through the purchase of 300 Bridge Street back in September. So we have just owned the property for less than a year. And the only access onto the property historically has been the drive-through that you see now on the plot plan. It's historically been there since, every picture I've looked at since 1925, but we'll say since the clerk subdivided the property, the access to 300 Bridge Street has been through that right-of-way, through that thoroughfare. And there are multiple neighbors that all have frontage along that same thoroughfare, and that has qualified as their frontage. And so that's why we got the opinion from our attorney that, in fact, there's enough historical precedence here to show that this is allowed. The second thing is that the road is maintained by all the neighbors. It is gravel. It's a road base, and there are plenty of trucks and traffic that use that thoroughfare. It's not just simply a driveway. It's actually a fairly reasonable road. And emergency vehicles, utility vehicles, that kind of thing all use the road. So anyway, but historically, this is the only path to get to the house. The only way to drive to the house is up through this road and through that driveway that we show on the plot plan.
Does that answer your question, Bill?
I really don't have a problem with this request for an A&R. All right, I think Lot B has frontage and Lot A has pre-existed and historically gotten its frontage off of the private way. So I don't have any problem with that. Would like clarification to make sure that this doesn't set a precedent for further subdivision along this private driveway. That is my concern, okay? That I have doubts whether future subdivision can occur and these lots can get their access off of that driveway, unless we approve the drive as some kind of road under our normal subdivision ordinance.
I think it would be a different condition if the lot being sold was the original access, and by selling it, they were then put in a non-conforming position with no frontage. That would be a different situation, but it sounds like, and I don't know what the disposition of it is now, but it sounds like this parcel has been existing for a while, and
It's a pasture. It's a pasture.
Yeah,
There's no
it's
there's no
owned. It is
access
owned by-
There's no access to Bridge Street.
it's owned by someone other than Lot A, is that correct?
Well, right now, we own that front section that I guess you're calling Lot A. Yeah, we own that existing parcel that goes, it's a little, kind of reaches towards Bridge Street there.
Yeah.
But right now, that's a pasture and has never had a road through it. I've looked at pictures from 1925, there is no road. So it's just simply was there to satisfy the frontage requirement, but it has never been used as access.
This is 175 foot long, so what is the
Yeah.
zone in this area?
It's
Patrick.
RA, 2 acre zone.
2 acres, that's at least 200 feet then, right? So-
I'm not proposing not to approve this,
Yeah,
but I am like to go on the record about any further development along this private way, which has never been approved as part of a subdivision law,
Right.
which is imposed on it since it existed, okay?
I want to make sure everybody's talking about the same thing. You're talking about the access to Lot A as it's identified on this chart, the big U-shaped road, is that correct?
Yes, it gets its access off of this.
It comes off Bridge Street on two places. Okay. But the problem is, that road down the line, down in some time in the future, could be developed into a reasonable street, could it
And that
not?
would require a subdivision approval by us, I think, to approve that, to say that meets current standards. And if you want to do further subdivision, you'd have to bring it up to standards. That's all I'm saying.
But that's not a big deal. I mean, it could be done.
It would have
Yes,
to
it
be
is
done.
part of a Form
Yeah,
B, yeah,
okay.
absolutely.
So I don't understand what the problem is.
I just wanted to known to the record that this doesn't set a precedent for doing Form As,
Yeah.
future Form As off of that drive.
Well, but if it's not the same drive anymore, if it's been developed, that changes everything, does it not?
Then they would have to come in as a Form B.
Right. Well, Richard,
So-
what Bill is saying is that if there were to be any future development on what is now denominated as Lot A, that road would have to be improved before we could consider any
Right,
future
I understand that,
development.
and that makes sense.
So
but
if
Otherwise,
if we agree on that, then I could entertain a motion to approve this A&R request, because
Yeah.
obviously it's true, and I know for a fact that this land fronting Bridge Street has been used for quite some time as paddocks, and that the only access to Breckenridge is as shown on this plot plan.
Are you suggesting that as a condition of approval?
Well, it's not really a condition of approval, but if they do come in for a subdivision, the road would have to be changed from just what it is now.
but,
Well, that would be true pending a legal opinion as to whether they do need to or not.
Right.
It wouldn't only be Lot A either, though, right? It would be also be the Sunshine Realty Trust plot, or anybody else requesting access off that easement or right-of-way. Because
Can any of you inform us what the intention is with respect to this property? Because that might be helpful.
Yeah, I would love to. So we bought the house to restore it. We're not planning on subdividing it. We're not planning on building condominiums. The intent here is to preserve the property. So as long as we own it, that's our plan. So again, we just bought it last September and certainly don't have any intention to subdivide the property. And I agree with you that if anybody did, let's say beyond us, who eventually sold the property down the road and somebody decided to subdivide it, it would have to come back to you guys as another plan, a subdivision plan, which is a completely different animal. What we're trying to do right now is just simply peel off that parcel and also formally recognize access that's existed for decades.
I make a motion, we approve this plan under the Form A provision that it does not need subdivision approval.
Second.
When I call your name, would you please indicate whether you are voting in favor of this motion? Richard Mitchell, Rick Mitchell,
Rick Mitchell, aye.
Richard Boroff,
Richard Boroff, aye.
Bill Wheaton,
Bill Wheaton, aye.
Jonathan Poor,
Jonathan Poor, aye.
Emil Dahlquist,
Emil Dahlquist, aye.
and Marnie Crouch, aye. So the A&R request for 300 Bridge Street is approved, and I apologize to the extent that this took maybe a little longer than you anticipated, but
That's quite all right. I'm sorry I wasn't on the call earlier, but thank you very much for your
No.
consideration today.
you own a beautiful property. It's very historic, and it's something that I think people driving through Hamilton always admire. So
Yeah.
I wish you every good luck in your renovations.
Yes, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Madam Chair.
Thank you.
Before we leave the topic, let me just mention to members that we need to have 5 members sign the plan over here that's on the table for the applicant.
Don't let us leave before we sign.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you for appearing.
Thank you. Thank you.
At this juncture, we will turn to consideration of the special permit request by Chabaco Hill Capital.
Excuse me,
Huh?
Madam, excuse me for interrupting. In some past meetings, we passed that kind of sheet around and had members sign it during the meeting. Do you want to do that now, or would you prefer to do it after the
I
meeting?
prefer to do it after.
Okay.
It's quite disruptive to for
Well,
all
yeah,
of us
but
to try
it's
and
been
do that.
done. I just want to let you know.
And it's rather large.
Well, that's a standard size.
Yes, but to pass around. So with that, we will begin our deliberations with respect to the special permit for 133 Essex Street and its associated application for a stormwater management permit. And I will repeat it this time that the members of the planning board who will be deliberating are Rick Mitchell, Richard Boroff, Bill Wheaton, Jonathan Poor, Emil Dahlquist, Pat Norton, and myself, Marnie Crouch. So with that said, I asked Patrick to distribute a memorandum that I prepared in conjunction with Emil, and this summary is for the benefit of the participants and the public who are appearing via Zoom. And in that memorandum, I identified an approach that we would be taking. The first thing that we did is we identified keywords that appear in the applicable bylaws, obviously the senior housing bylaw, but also the open space and farmland preservation development bylaw, which is incorporated by reference into the senior housing bylaw, as well as the special permit bylaw, section 10.5, which in subsection 2 lists criteria for evaluating special permits. So we have developed that keyword document, and then we also organized our deliberations around certain categories. So we have a framework that we're going to discuss how this project relates to the environment, how it relates to the site, and how it relates to the community. And I think that once we begin our deliberations, it will be clear why that is a better approach than just proceeding bylaw section by bylaw section, which would be a very disjointed discussion. So with that said, the first order of business is to hear from Attorney Robin Stein, who is just going to provide a summary of the standard for the issuance of special permits. And this is for the benefit of planning board members and who may have some uncertainty as to the planning board's discretion with respect to the issuance of bylaws. So Attorney Stein, you have the microphone.
Good evening again. Robin Stein from KP Law. We're town council to the town of Hamilton. Marnie, as she said, asked me to just give a brief summary of the special permit standards as they apply generally into this project. And so I'm going to give you that. And if you have questions, let me know. And obviously, if questions come up, you can always pose them to me. So generally, Chapter 40A, Section 9 authorizes the planning board to grant a special permit for a use that is in harmony with the general purpose and intent of the town zoning bylaws. And that section also provides that uses may be subject to general or specific provisions in the zoning bylaw. Hamilton's zoning bylaw contains both general and specific provisions that relate to this application, to special permits, and to the senior housing special permit. So for example, Section 10.5.2 of the zoning bylaw contains the general criteria for issuing special permits, in general, the findings that the board needs to make. Section 8.2 in its entirety applies to the senior housing special permits, to senior housing projects. Section 8.2 contains the purposes for that section. Section 8.231 contains the findings that the planning board has to make in order to issue a senior housing special permit in particular. And then there are various other sections of 8.2 that contain project requirements that have to be met. And they're all, again, laid out in the town zoning bylaw. In order to grant a special permit, and to grant this special permit, the planning board has to find that all of the requirements of the project are met. The planning board does act with discretion, however, in considering special permit applications. And even if the board even if the record indicates that a particular special permit could lawfully be granted because the applicant has satisfied all the statutory and regulatory criteria in the bylaw, the board does retain discretion. It can approve or it can deny the permit application. Any approval of the special permit application needs to contain detailed findings that evidence that the board made every finding the bylaw requires them to make in the zoning act as well. Any denial should also state the reasons for a denial. A denial has to be based on legally tenable grounds, and it cannot be unreasonable, whimsical, capricious, or arbitrary. And what that means in practice, in general, is that any denial of a special permit application has to be based on credible evidence related to legitimate zoning concerns, legitimate matters within the standards of the bylaw and the zoning act. Certainly the board, while it has discretion to deny a permit, cannot do so for reasons that are unrelated to the zoning standards and to the scope of its review under the bylaw and under the zoning act. In the end, regardless of how the board votes, again, I recommend that specific findings be made, citing facts in the record as it applies to the particular criteria, not just stating the criteria themselves, but tying it to the specific facts in the record. And again, if the board approves the project, it needs to make specific findings for each area. Can't just repeat statutory language. And then one, last comment, sometimes questions will come up about particular areas of concern, and to the extent that, a board has any peer review on that particular area, you may want to consider following the peer review's guidance and deferring to them on the areas which you have that help. So that is the basics of special permits, and if you have questions, please let me know.
Yeah, Robin, that was, I'm glad you read that. It is a little bit contradictory, though. It says that the board can still not approve the permit even though it has met all the objective criteria laid out in the bylaw under consideration.
So,
And then it goes on to say you can't use capricious, unreasonable, or vague reasons for doing that. So it's a little contradictory.
well, so what the courts are saying in that case is, even if the record demonstrates there could be sufficient information in this record that would let you approve this, you also have discretion as you apply that, and the courts defer to your local knowledge, and in applying that discretion, if you find, even though we have this information that one could argue could support it, you do have leeway and ability to deny if you can articulate specific facts that tie to the areas that you're regulating. And I understand it is a little confusing, but that's where the discretion that comes in. It's just because you could doesn't mean you have to, but you certainly can. And if you don't, you need to be very, you need to explain why, and it needs to be within the scope of your lawful review.
So in your opinion, is it the senior housing bylaw that is the governing bylaw that we need to be using as the criteria for determining whether in fact the special permit meets?
Well, I think it's Chapter 48, Section 9, which authorizes the board to grant special permits that are in harmony with the general purposes of the bylaw, and then it is all of the applicable bylaw provisions. So Section 10.5.2 has your general special permit requirements, and then Section 8.2 is the senior housing, and there in Section 82317, it refers back to design standards from Section 8.1, since they're referred to in there, they would be applicable as well. But it is all of the applicable portions of the bylaw that apply specifically to this project. So like I said, there are general and specific requirements.
So would it be your recommendation that the board be focusing on objective criteria as opposed to subjective criteria as it's first passed?
Well, it's not, I don't have a recommendation for how the board conducts its deliberations. It's my recommendation ultimately that the board evaluate the project and apply all of the standards that it's required to apply. How you do that, I leave to you and to the chair. But ultimately, there are a number of different standards that apply to this project, and my recommendation is they all be considered and that findings be made as they relate to them.
I understand what you're saying, Robin, and if there's any uncertainty, I can clarify when we conclude our deliberations. So, I have a bit of a history lesson for all of us. Jill Mann indicated at the last hearing, her presentation on July 26, 2022, that the senior housing bylaw should not be considered in a vacuum. And I agree with her sentiment there. And so before we begin our deliberations, I thought it would be helpful if we put the senior housing bylaw in context. And so I reviewed our bylaw, and I will just briefly summarize some of the considerations that we might want to keep in mind when we begin our deliberations. So Section 1.1 of our zoning bylaw sets forth the purpose of the bylaw, and there are 5 provisions, I think 2 of which are pertinent to consideration of a special permit. And they are to promote the health, safety, morals, convenience, and general welfare of the inhabitants of Hamilton. And then the 5th purpose is to improve and beautify the town by encouraging the most appropriate uses of land within the town in accordance with the general or master plan and under the provisions of Chapter 40A of Mass General Laws. And there's also a reference to another act of the Massachusetts legislature. So if we look at the 2004 master plan, we do have both guidance and goals set forth in that document that we should keep in mind. So the master plan, with respect to land use, talks about resource protection, and it says development should protect the quality of Hamilton's wetland and water resources and foster a reduction in water uses per capita, recognizing the need for flexibility to preserve horse pastures and serve agricultural uses. It also references sustainability, which, given our present drought, is something that we cannot simply ignore. It says, whenever possible, commercial and residential development should occur in established areas while preserving the small-town character of downtown Hamilton and neighborhoods, all as part of a comprehensive plan to preserve open space and farmland and to connect available attractive neighborhoods with retail services and community facilities. The master plan also references agriculture and indicates that farming and equestrian activities are rooted in Hamilton's history, and they enjoy a preferred position in town. And finally, there's also a reference to scenic views. With respect to land use goals, the first goal is to preserve large undisturbed forest, open space and agricultural land, equestrian facilities, trails, and trail connections. Another goal is to respect the capacity and quality of Hamilton's wetland, surface, and groundwater resources, provide housing choice that meets the social, economic, and lifestyle needs of multi-generational, economically diverse community, encourage development that is environmentally sustainable and less costly to the town, and there are other goals as well, but I won't repeat them. And then with respect to open space and resource protection goals, there are a number of them, but the first is to significantly increase the amount of protected open space by preserving large, ecologically significant tracts of forest, habitat corridors, and water resources. Preserve and encourage rural working landscapes, agricultural and equestrian. Encourage public use and enjoyment of Hamilton's open space by maintaining and linking the equestrian trail network and providing passive recreational opportunities throughout the town. Protect the capacity and quality of Hamilton's wetlands, surface, and groundwater resources. Assure the endurance of historic buildings, stone walls, mature trees, and vistas that represent Hamilton's history and define its visual character. And with respect to housing goals, they include to provide a mix of housing that is visually compatible with Hamilton's tradition of single-family residences, to develop moderately priced housing units that are affordable and attractive to elderly households, to protect and retain Hamilton's inventory of small homes. In the open space, the 2009 Open Space and Recreation Plan, you're all encouraged to read this, but I will just set forth one provision that I thought was quite enlightening. It says, Hamilton's open space program is not intended to promote or prevent development, to provide municipal revenue, or to determine land use. Such considerations result in the pitting of economic interests against environmental ones, with the risk of the latter losing out. Rather, this plan is intended as a guide to preserving the various resources under the open space umbrella as Hamilton continues to grow and change. Another interesting document, and I don't know whether you all are familiar with it, the Hamilton Reconnaissance Report, which was part of the Essex County Landscape Inventory, that lists Chabaco Road as a scenic road and encourages the maintenance of the visual quality of the scenic roads. The Housing Production Plan that was produced in 2009 did identify 133 Essex Street as a potential development site. And finally, I wanted to mention the open space residential development or conservation subdivision design model bylaw. And that model bylaw was promulgated in 2000, and it forms the basis of the open space and farmland preservation development bylaw. That the section 8.1 of our bylaw has remarkable similarities to that model conservation subdivision bylaw. And so what I did, I put a handout on each of, where each of you are sitting, and it sets forth the purposes of the model bylaw, and you can compare that to the senior housing bylaw, the open space and farmland preservation development bylaw, as well as the purpose of the zoning bylaw in and of itself. So as you can see from these various documents, some of the policies, the goals, they're all pertinent to our deliberations. And so I think our purpose here today is to harmonize these various goals in a way that makes sense for the town of Hamilton and can be based upon the senior housing bylaw and also section 10.5.2, as well as the open space and farmland preservation development bylaw. It would appear to me that although Hamilton is interested in developing as a town, it has a strong conservation goals, and the model bylaw and the related open space and farmland preservation development bylaw do establish how that conservation goal should be achieved when evaluating various and sundry development schemes. So with that said, I just want to reiterate the framework within which we're going to deliberate. And I know you've all had an opportunity to review it, and I hope you agree with me that it is a good way to proceed in organizing our thoughts rather than to go bylaw section by bylaw section. We will eventually get to that at the conclusion of our deliberations, but I don't think that's a good starting point. And then the other thing I would like to indicate is that I would like all of us to feel free to participate in these discussions. As I indicated in my memo, although we did list various topics pertinent to the three main relationships of the project to the environment, to the site, and to the community, those topics are not limited. So if anyone has anything else that they would like to discuss in relationship to those categories, I urge you to bring them forward. And then finally, what I did in preparing for this evening's hearing is I attempted to formulate a list of questions so that we could discuss things in depth. And I don't know how many of you here are familiar with the Socratic method. I know Robin is familiar with the Socratic method as an attorney, as am I. And for the edification of the board, when you were in law school, if you think that the professor was going to provide you with any particular guidance as to how to interpret case law, you're wrong. The professor merely asks questions, and in the process of asking those questions will frequently embarrass the student. But in addition to that, the professors will call on people at random. So I don't know if Legally Blonde provided you with any indication of how this works, but if you want to know how it works at Harvard University, if you're a sorority girl with a chihuahua, you could watch that movie. But with that said, I also would like to conclude this meeting as close to 9:30 as possible. I think we have a lot of ground to cover. I don't think there's any way we could complete our deliberations this evening. So I think that having a reasonable cutoff time might be helpful. And then when we resume, we can regroup, and if there's anything that we've omitted with respect to the material we've covered, we can then revisit it if warranted, and then continue on with our discussion. So with that said, does anyone have any questions or concerns about what I've just said? Rick?
Madam Chairman, I thought it might be useful if we poll the members and give each member 5 minutes to express, what it is they find in this development that supports approval in the bylaw and what they find in this development that does not support approval. So we get a little sense about how the various board members feel about this project, rather than, and then we sort of, lay our cards out on the table in a sense, and then we can have discussion after that. But I, for one, don't know how other people, what are the issues that concern people about this development. I don't know how the other board members feel, and I would like to know.
Right. Emil, did you want to make a comment? I know Rick
Yeah, I think-
also wants to make a comment.
I think in that question is a good question. I think this is still part of the deliberation process. We're still fact-finding. I think that would be a very useful conversation more toward the end when we go through. This has been pretty much a one-sided conversation from the beginning. From the flow has been in one direction, to be honest. I'm looking forward to having just what you're saying, each one of us participate, and I hope everybody does, in all of these topics and questions, and that Marty's going to read off, because this is really probative. This really gets to the heart, and I think that whatever your opinion of the project now is, I think it'll be either reinforced or changed by having some further, deeper discussions. I think that would be a better way to do it. I'm not opposed to what you're saying, but I just think that would be a good way to go forward.
Rick, what did you have in mind?
Well, I was going to have a question relative to the process, but I would agree with Emil on that, because we would actually be probably prejudicing our entire decision-making process by having people basically present whatever their opinion is right now.
Mm.
And then the question is, why are we even doing this then? Because it would be apparent from that discussion where if they'd already made up their mind or not, and then it's like, well, we're done. So I think we really need, out of fairness to everybody involved, is to go through all the data and then discuss it in detail, as Emil suggested, and then come to a conclusion.
Well, I think that maybe the compromise is to go forward with our discussions dealing with the relationship of the project to the environment, the site, and the community. But at the conclusion of the deliberation with respect to each category, I think that we can then express our view as to any problems, concerns, or determinations we've made about that particular aspect. Is that something that would satisfy you, Bill?
I guess so.
Marty, can I ask a question? Maybe you can just talk about when a vote will take place in the process, you know,
Right.
or how that's going to happen.
The way I envision this is that we will conclude our deliberations. I have, for my own edification, listed a number of bylaw sections that I don't believe are in controversy. They're germane to some of our purposes and findings, but they're not disputed. So there's no real reason why we need to do anything other than to recognize them. And so one example would be the inclusionary housing bylaw payment of $2,174,000. That is a given. So we don't have to include that aspect in our deliberation. It will come up in the findings when we have to consider the fiscal impacts of this project, but that's not something that we need to debate. Similarly, we have evidence as to the number of parking spaces for each unit and that type of thing. That is not something that we need to deliberate on, whether they've complied with that requirement. So I identified a number of bylaws that really no one's going to contest whether they've been satisfied or not. Another example would be that this project is within the requisite distance of another senior housing, but that's not disputed. So these are things that when it comes to the time to write a decision, we will include it in the decision, but we don't have to deliberate on that topic. And I think with that said, barring any other comments.
Yeah, I wanted to get to my first one before Bill interjected his.
You had another
I'm
one, okay,
looking,
sorry.
and first of all, thank you for doing, obviously, you spent a great deal of time on this and put a lot of thought into putting this together, so I applaud your effort here. So
Thank you, Rick.
I do have a question, though, in step 2, and the criteria for decision-making.
Is there another one of those? I don't have one of
Criteria for
those.
decision-making will actually determine and can determine the outcome of the decision. The funnel by which you sift the information will determine the outcome. So I'm looking at these, and my first reaction, and I'm just telling you what my first reaction is, so it may not be where you intended to go.
What page are you on, Rick, just so I?
See it.
Page 1 of your memorandum.
Oh, okay.
Step 2.
Step 2.
Okay.
Organize our deliberative process by correlating keywords into 3 broad and distinct framework categories. And they are the relationship of the project to the natural environment, 2, the relationship of the project to the site, and 3, the relationship to the project and the neighborhood and the community. So I looked at that and I said immediately, those are all subjective decisions. So I'm wondering if you're saying that the applicant has met all the other objective criteria and you don't need to discuss those.
Well, no, I beg to differ. I mean, these are not subjective criteria. It's just that when we break those categories down, then we can consider the bylaws that are really applicable to that discussion in that context. So, for example, we have, if you look at the key words, one of them some of them are in the findings, and it's, they're visual and noise buffering. We wouldn't consider that whether they've met that bylaw finding in the context of relationship to the environment. We would consider that in relation to the community, because it's the community that would be affected by the noise. Do you follow me? We tried to organize it so that there was as little overlap as possible with respect to these different purposes and findings.
So are you saying that you will, within each of these categories, that you will be applying objective criteria?
Of course,
Well,
of course.
I'm just saying, the I just got it yesterday. My first read is I'm going, well, those are very subjective. And if, without the detail that you provided, I wouldn't know that. So I'm going.
Well, I'm glad you raised that
The
then.
screening criteria is a little going to the subjective rather than the objective, and that's why.
Well, it's just a format to organize the deliberations in a way that made sense, as opposed to just starting with purposes and going bylaw by bylaw, which really, we can't dig deep when we do that type of an analysis.
I just wanted to make sure I was clear on sort of the structure and how this was being applied, because you gotta, when you start, you need to know what your filtering criteria are and where you're going.
Well, I was hoping that the topics might have, given you some kind of, an indication of what we were going to talk about, and how those topics really related to the different categories. But let's proceed, and again, I want to reiterate to everyone that although, I've listed a number of questions I want to raise. Bill, for example, if you have questions, or Pat, you have questions, anybody, if you have questions in addition to mine, please ask them. And if you have topics that I may have omitted that you think are important in the context of the relationship that we're discussing, I have no problem discussing them unless, for example, they're really more germane to another category. I was hoping we could avoid as much repetition as possible. But with that said, I think I'll just dive in and ask the first question. And so, the one thing that I did do is try and ask a really broad question that we won't answer initially. It's just the question that when we finally conclude our deliberations with respect to that relationship, we can come to some type of a conclusion. So the overriding question is whether the development is ecologically responsible. And we can then, following our deliberations, reach some type of conclusion with
Just a
respect to
question,
that.
Marnie, if you're referring to the document or memorandum, can you?
No, I'm now referring to my own notes.
Okay.
So now you're on your own,
Just-
or-
okay, I just
So
wanna
I may
know-
call on you with a
I just want to
question.
know where you're going and if I'm supposed to be reading something as you're
No.
moving.
No, you do not have to read anything. Although if you have your bylaws handy, that's never a bad idea.
I do.
One of the first things I did when I joined the planning board, I asked Patrick for a copy of the zoning bylaw, and it's in this black book.
Excuse me, Marnie, for a second, just a process question. A number of folks don't necessarily have copies of the framework. I don't know whether anybody has spare copies, whether there's an ability to make copies so that people can read along. I don't know how many people
How
need.
unfortunate.
Madam Chair, I apologize. I never saw this.
Patrick forwarded it to you.
I'm sure he did. I just never saw it. I may not have looked at my emails.
Does anyone else not have a
I never
copy
saw
of
it.
you don't have the memorandum I sent?
Oh.
Does anyone else not have the
I don't have it printed, no. I've been reading it on my,
Patrick, would it be possible?
I can make copies, sure.
Okay. Patrick will make copies, and then,
Thank you, Pat. I apologize.
Jonathan, this was just for the 4 bylaw sections, is that part of the
the
framework?
The memorandum that was sent out. Folks don't have
Yeah.
that, the
Oh, okay.
memorandum that was sent out.
Okay.
Excuse me, I'm going to make a trip while he's doing that.
Sure. For the members of the public and the participants, we have a little pause here to make some copies, and get some water. Would anyone else like some water?
no, thank you.
What can I say?
I'll take one, Richard. Thank you.
All set?
All set?
Joe, you're all set.
You want a paper copy?
If you have
I'm all set.
You got one?
Mhm.
What's that?
Six are all missing.
Seems thinner than yours, maybe.
Yes, because I have single pages. I'm very wasteful.
Everybody got one?
Everybody's
Set.
got one.
Of the odds.
Seem to not have printed the even pages.
this memo.
You have this?
Can we screen share this, Pat?
Yeah,
Can you
this.
bring that up?
Sorry?
Would you be able
Yes.
to bring that up?
If I had I don't have the Wi-Fi passcode on my
Okay,
computer.
that's
It's coming as guest.
10-4s.
Yeah, 5 of 9. Yeah, missing a little bit.
Apologies to the participants. When we appear on Zoom, everybody stays at their desk, and now that we're meeting in person, we have some activity.
Patrick,
Yes, sir.
That was the guest one?
this is only every other page.
That was not.
You've got 5, 3.
Oh, what I gave you, I
You've got
print,
1, 3, 5,
I always print.
7, and 9. Down at the bottom.
You probably just ran it through. I double-side all my documents.
Oh, darn.
Home printer, save paper.
Back to the copier.
Sorry about that.
It's Hamilton.
light.
Sorry, Patrick, it's Hamilton guest, is it? 10-4s?
Yes, yeah, 10-4s.
Do you think I should ask Chris what he's eating?
Look on that new bone.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Do I have the link
Oh, that's, yeah.
from okay.
You trying to move that to it?
See if I got this.
Oh, yeah. One click.
At the current pace, this is going to be a long, slow.
Process.
Yeah.
Maybe I should announce now that if anyone has to use the facilities, please go now, so we don't have another interruption.
A cutoff time in mind, you said you wanted,
9:30.
okay.
Megan, you may have to include me as a panelist or somebody else to present. That's what's being, thank you.
Are you making a presentation?
I think Patrick wanted me to put up the memo
Oh, okay.
up on the board.
What we're looking at, got it.
Yeah, yeah.
Why don't we sign this thing while we're waiting for Patrick?
Good idea.
You have to use this pen, by the way, because it's paper. Is there a Mylar, Marty?
Pardon
Is
me?
there a Mylar?
You'd have to ask Patrick, I don't know.
I don't see one here. Is it just Rick and me? We the only
I'll
ones
sign
who
it.
can sign it?
I'll sign it too. Just need 5.
An opinion, but it's an opinion.
What do you think instead of
That's an opinion.
not computer science? Where were you attending school? Oh, very good. Will you live at home?
Hey, Mom.
Yeah.
What's this word? Whatever.
So do you need one more there?
The affection and
Affection and respect of
Is that Taft?
yes. I'm pretty sure.
Yeah.
Definitely not Teddy Roosevelt.
No.
No, definitely. Or Abraham Lincoln.
Not sheep, cats.
Post office here.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I think it's all set.
Meyer was the postmaster general.
Mhm.
That's why that's here.
There was a movement afoot not too long ago, because I was part of moving the Northeast District region of the U.S. Postal Service from Manhattan Island up to Connecticut. And, I had to design a space for them. I had to go down and interview everybody in the organization, and then top to bottom, and document all the file work, and all. It was just drudgery, but move them all up there. But there was a movement at that time to create this kit of parts. They wanted all post offices to be identical across the country, especially in the interior. I can understand that when you're standardization. But they wanted all the exteriors. But there was an outcry, sounds like this, with that particular post office.
You familiar with that?
Raised heck with
For the specific country.
the Postal Service. They're actually one of the few organizations that can say to the zoning commission, do whatever you like. We're going to do We're going to do what we're going to do.
Right.
Because they're a federal agency.
It's like the federal communications,
Yeah.
the cell towers.
Yeah.
They're moving almost as much legislatively do here. It's just, it's made a news.
We're able to get up on the big screen as well.
But I can imagine.
It's worth looking at.
I can imagine.
Won't have Marnie's notes, though.
Thanks.
Set.
It's over here.
I don't know.
I'm all set.
I could,
Okay,
Seen that before.
shall we proceed?
If you're referring to your memo, I think you should have it up so folks can see what you're referring to. But if you're not, then maybe you can take it down so they can see who's speaking.
I actually am not referring to my memo at this point. I mean, I'm happy that everyone has a copy of it, but I'm proceeding to questions that I developed in relation to the relationships that are articulated in the memo. So the first question I have, and this might be something that Emil can address, but we know that the Open Space and Farmland Preservation Development Bylaw had its origin in the Conservation Subdivision Model Bylaw. And I'm wondering what that Conservation Subdivision Bylaw had to say that is so relevant to Section 8.1.12. And so perhaps Emil can elaborate on that, but I will indicate that the applicant maintains that it is preserving farmland and 42 acres of open space, all of which will be subject to a conservation restriction. So doesn't that commitment satisfy the purposes of the Model Conservation Bylaw, and then by inference, Section 8.1.12 of our Open Space and Farmland Development Bylaw, and concomitantly, the Senior Housing Bylaw?
Marty, is that in here, or were you reading?
No, these are questions I developed after I did the memo.
So, as the only person on the planning board that actually was there when we drafted this open space farmland and preservation bylaw, well, it's patterned after that. This was actually the second bylaw that we attempted after the master plan to craft, with the goal of, for the first time in Hamilton's history, is promoting and allowing more than one house on 1 acre. So I wouldn't read too much into going back into the conservation preservation bylaw. And this bylaw was subject to a great deal of consternation. It was definitely pitchforks and torches when we even broached the idea of having more than 1 unit on an acre of land. So I think it might be a little bit of an overreach to try and go back and say, well, gee, the intent was to model this after the conservation bylaw. The intent was to try and get the public to agree that we could have the option to develop more than one unit per acre. And it created a great deal of conservation, and this is why, in fact, it became totally voluntary. And if you read the bylaw, it is extremely convoluted. And it's all totally voluntary because the populace at the time would not support the concept of a by right or any other idea of having to allow more than 1 unit per acre. So while I appreciate you're doing the research and suggesting that, does it meet the intent of that? All of these, the Open Space Farmland Preservation Development Bylaw and the Senior Housing Bylaw, were very political documents. They were fashioned in a very tumultuous environment. As I mentioned multiple times to probably the boredom of everybody on this board, is the Senior Housing Bylaw took 3 attempts to pass at town meeting. And it got dramatically changed, the wording got dramatically changed, it got watered down to try and make it more acceptable to the populace in general. So I wouldn't try and read too much into what the intent was, trying to go back in time.
Well,
I can respond to that because I have studied the Conservation Subdivision Bylaw, and the pertinent part of that bylaw, which is incorporated in the Open Space and Farmland Preservation Development Bylaw, is the special design process in 8.1.12.
Yeah, that
And,
makes sense. That
yes,
that makes sense.
That's what I'm getting at,
Okay,
because
good.
Section 8.1.12 really bookends the whole senior housing bylaw, and as you all know, the last finding in Section 8.2 that we have to make, Section 8.2.31.7, specifically requires us to find that there is compliance with the special design process. And so in the models conservation subdivision, there's a design process that's set forth that's remarkably similar to what is in Section 8.1.12, and I can just summarize briefly that step 1 is identifying conservation areas, step 2 is locating housing site, step 3 is aligning the streets and trails, and step 4 is lot lines. Now, we have a little bit more expansive design process in Section 8.1.12, but it tracks that model quite well. So I don't know if anybody has anything else to add to that, but
For
that-
context, go ahead.
but that design process is quite critical to our evaluation of this project, so. John.
For additional context, as well as it being bookended in the senior housing bylaw, what's interesting is in the stormwater management standards from the state, which is also part of this application and is part of the applicable bylaws, that same wording, that same process that's found in 8.1.12, the special permit design process, is mirrored almost verbatim in Volume 1, Volume 2 of the Stormwater Management Standards, and in the Erosion and Sediment Control Guidelines by Mass DEP. In fact, in the Mass DEP, it literally outlines the steps in the same way. So, and what I think is very useful to look at, and is a great opening discussion, I think, for the board, is under 8.1.12, the very first step has a heading, identification of conservation areas, and there's a great big run-on sentence after that heading, and that run-on sentence has 4 distinct components, and I think it's worth looking at those components and asking ourselves sort of what they mean. So the first component is regulated conservation areas, and that would be your wetlands, your buffer zones, your vernal pools, and whatever else is covered under regulation. The second part of that sentence is unprotected natural landscape features. And that includes steep slopes, mature woodlands, prime farmlands. I'm just reading out of the bylaw. Meadows, wildlife habitats, wildlife corridors, or connections there too. That's the second part. The third part is cultural features, such as historic and archaeological sites and scenic views. And then the fourth part is recreational features, such as established trails, and so on. So there's 4 pieces to that. And those 4 pieces are also, like I said, mirrored in other applicable bylaws here. So I think it's useful to talk about, and again, where this is bookended, it's the beginning of the process and it's the end of the process. It's the first step in the process of designing and reviewing it. It's the last step in the findings. It's worth breaking down those 4 parts and looking at this project in relationship to those 4 parts. I think that's an interesting discussion.
It's also exactly stated the same way in the low-impact development literature. So, I mean, it appears many times, whatever the town of Hamilton struggled over in terms of the crafting of the words, it just exists in so many places. It's kind of
So my question is,
unassailable. But I just want to say the other important part of this is that this represents the beginning. The designer, and I'm talking about the applicant, their first job was to go onto the site and take a look at the site. That was their first job. It was the beginning of the project. And as Jonathan said, and Marnie, it's also our last finding that we have to deal with. And because of that combination, it adds its importance. And this is really all about how closely was conservation subdivision regulations or recommendations or techniques followed on the project. And it's about that. And because it appears in so many other areas, that one of the one of the struggles here is we just slavishly followed the bylaw words. It's word for word. And we could never get too far away from that when Marnie and I were working on this. It was just, we wanted it to be that way because we did not want it to be subjective or any of that, but we wanted it to be grounded completely in the bylaws. The words are there, and that's what we're trying to deal with, you know, in this, to understand what the intent was. The other issue, and Rick, you can add your comment, but the other issue for me is that what it says about the town of Hamilton, when they adopted this, they adopted it about the same time as the smart growth indication in the purposes. They, you know, adopted the low impact development. There was a series of decisions made by the town of Hamilton that were all based on sustainability. And that is the importance of this particular bylaw and how it fits into the larger picture, that sustainability aspect. And we're going to get more into smart growth and some of the other low impact developments. So I think what we'd like to do is kind of get, this all came about, and there's no disagreement about the 1 acre zoning and cluster housing and that's all part of this, but we'll get into some detail about that.
Well, my next question.
I'm not, this is not an argument. Says identify these, which is fine. So the question is, I mean, I don't know, and help me out with the process here, because we, you know, went into dissecting this into 4 component pieces.
Mm-hmm.
Are we going to go through each one and dissect them into component pieces?
No.
Or, let me finish.
Yeah.
Or are we going to look at that and say, has the application met the requirement, and in this case, identification of these particular items?
Well, I think it's a little bit more than identification. I mean, if it was simply identifying, it would be meaningless.
Okay, but look, I'm looking at the words now. Everybody's,
I understand
everybody's,
that.
well, let me finish. Everybody's telling me the words mean things. It says the first step in the design process requires identification. So that's my question. I want to keep these tight and narrow. I don't want to go off on academic, theoretical discussions about what a word means unless there's some critical reason to do so.
Excuse me, Rick. I'm going to proceed here because we can get too bogged down.
Right.
So the section 8.1.12 does indicate that an applicant needs to identify these various aspects of a site, but it's part of a special design process.
Understood.
The purpose of identifying them is not to simply identify them. It's to incorporate them into the design of the project. So the next question I have is, does this development demonstrate?
We lost the Zoom. Can we take a second to get it back up?
Yeah, it's the connection.
Okay, let's just pause for a second so no one misses anything. We'll get it back up.
Well, I think while you're waiting for that, I'm gonna play the devil's advocate here.
If you don't mind,
There's no Zoom connection, you
public
can't.
has to
Okay.
go watch the deliberations, so
Okay.
if we could just either get it back up or we'll.
Probably not. We can go home. Ah, the vagaries of Wi-Fi. Oh, looks like you're back.
The host.
Make sure we, hold on a second there, because did you lose all your participants, or are they still there? Okay, so it's just you that kind of.
What do you have on your, still there?
No, it said network connection failed.
Say again?
The network connection had failed for me.
Too many people on?
Totally, and there's no way of getting it back.
It happened.
Unstable?
Everybody's still there, right?
Okay, we're back.
Okay. So let's proceed to the next question, and that question is, does this development demonstrate sensitive site design that aligns with the design process parameters of the Open Space and Farmland Preservation Development Bylaw, specifically Section 8.1.12? And indeed, is there even a definition of sensitive site design?
Could you show me where that is again?
No, these are my questions, Rick. They're not written down anywhere. I have written them for my benefit to ask you, the members of the board, the question.
Okay.
Does anyone wish to respond to that question?
So environmentally sensitive site design is defined very, very, very specifically in all of the stormwater management standards. It's quite elaborate and quite consistent. And it aligns perfectly, again, with 8.1.12, and it talks about the second, it leads us into the second step, which is identification and delineation of the proposed development area, that's the second item in 8.1.12. And I can read it. Second step in the design process is to define and delineate the area that will contain buildings, roadways, other site improvements, and amenities for residents of the development. To the maximum extent feasible, the proposed development area shall consist of land outside the identified conservation areas. So again, there's 4 components to that. And that same wording is repeated more emphatically in all of the stormwater management standards. And it's much more specific.
Well, let me just ask you, though, because the applicant has informed us that this site is not sensitive, that it's not in an aquifer, it's not in a wellhead preservation area, there's no surface water protection area, it's not in a regional water resource area, and it's not mapped for priority habitat. So if it's not a sensitive site, at least in the applicant's view, how do these circumstances affect a determination of whether there's sensitive site design?
I'll happily continue unless somebody else wants to jump in. So in the assertions that the applicant has made, that doesn't include all of the elements that I just listed out as what's required to be identified. For example, steep slopes and wildlife corridors. And then in addition to that, what's interesting in the stormwater bylaws is after they say you need to steer clear of these things, they also mention over and over again to minimize the creation of lawns if you disrupt these things, you want to minimize creation of lawns. So what I would say is that's the second part of the identification process. The third part is cultural features, and it talks about historic and archaeological sites and scenic views. Well, Chewbacca Road is designated as a scenic road. So I would put that in that category. That's open for discussion if the board disagrees with that, but I would put the fact that Chewbacca Road is a scenic road in that third category. And in past hearings, I've delineated what the characteristics of Chewbacca Road are as a scenic road. I don't want to repeat that. I can repeat it at some other point. And then the last piece is recreational features, and I would say that with the recreational features, you have a trail system. So, and whether or not the applicant asserts that the aquifer or the wetlands or the vernal pools are considered sensitive sites, sensitive conservation areas, there are a number of other elements that need to be combined with that, including Chewbacca Road, including the steep slopes, including wildlife corridors, and look at the process as a whole in its entirety, rather than just in silos, in terms of peer review of water resources or stormwater management.
Well, you know what, the next question I have, and this really sprang to mind after really reviewing the special design process, is whether this project is integrated with the development site or imposed upon it.
Well,
And I think that's really important to consider, especially in conjunction with the evidence we have that the applicant has developed other projects. Canterbrook is one example, and then the village at Magnolia Shores. And just for my own edification, I drove through Canterbrook the other day, and that site is far different than this one. It was already cleared. It is virtually level, and had none of the constraints on development that this particular site has. And I know from looking at the village of Magnolia Shores that also is quite a different condominium development, in that the duplex units there seem to be much farther apart. So, I mean, I'd be interested in knowing whether, people think that this site is well integrated into the landscape in conformance with that design process.
I'm wondering if we're getting ahead of ourselves here. Again, this needs to be a defensible decision that we're going to be making.
We're getting to
Now,
that.
let
We're
me,
getting
no,
to that,
I want
Rick.
to, no, this is an important decision that's going to affect the future of this town financially, environmentally, structurally. And you're having this wonderful discussion about, in this detailed academic discussion, but I'm trying to apply the bylaw as it is written and intended to determine if, in fact, the applicant has met the criteria that is written in the bylaw,
We
not
get-
whether we're interpreting it.
Rick, I have to interrupt you, and I hate to take a page from your playbook, but if you continually interrupt and do not want to deliberate.
No,
I will explain to you why we are going through this process.
Okay.
And it's section 8.2.31.7.
And what is that?
That's a finding that we have to make,
I understand.
and I will read it to you.
I understand that.
But that's what we're getting at.
So
We
I'm-
can't just say yes or no. We have to ascertain whether in fact it complies or not. And so if you're,
I'm going to interrupt. I think Rick's right. I think he's got the right point. And I don't follow what you're doing at all. And I think we should pay more attention to what Rick is asking.
he's
Well,
asking about how
I don't
this,
think we need to
excuse me, Richard, he's asking how the discussion that I'm trying to elicit from you pertains to a specific bylaw. And what I'm telling him, and I am telling you, that it in fact does pertain to a specific bylaw. And that bylaw is 8.2.31.7. Demonstrate compliance with the intent of section 8.1, open space and farmland preservation development, special permit design process in order to encourage
And
cluster development.
exactly, that's exactly what I am doing, Marnie. I am looking at 8.1.2, and it says identification. And the second step in the design process is define and delineate. The third step is identify and delineate. The fourth step is identify and delineate. So, The question is, has the applicant met the standard of the bylaw that you're referring to? That's the question. It's real simple.
Well,
Yes,
okay, I'll
no, it is-
answer it for you, because I already did once. But there's no purpose in identifying all these different aspects of a site if you then proceed to ignore them. I mean, the identification is to facilitate the development of a project that meets the design criteria of a conservation subdivision. So simply identifying something doesn't make it a good project. It doesn't mean that the design takes into proper account the different aspects of this site. It is something that we have to explore, and we can't say, they identified it, case closed. I mean,
I agree with you. I absolutely agree with you.
so that's why I'm trying to,
I agree with Marnie. I absolutely agree with you.
Thank you.
I'm just, this is referenced in the senior housing bylaw
Yes, it
as a
is.
component piece that you should go through and do as part of your application, right?
well, as part of your application, as part of your design.
Yeah?
When you design the
Right.
project, you have to consider this.
Absolutely.
And so that's what we want to talk about, is how the design of this project fits within the landscape. So I ask, is this project integrated into that landscape in a way that would satisfy the design process that was originally articulated in the conservation subdivision? Or is it just imposed on that site, bearing in mind that 40 feet of the granite hilltop is going to be blasted away, and there are going to be 50 units of housing on that site? So is it integrated into that site in a meaningful way in compliance with Section 8.1.12, or is it not? And that's the discussion point, because obviously, as I mentioned, the applicant has provided in its application the preservation of 42 acres of open space. It's a given, 9.4 acres of farmland, and they've indicated that there will be trails around the perimeter of the property. So on the one hand, you could say that there is some effort there, or the other, you could say that maybe not. So I am trying to elicit that
I think
discussion.
Marnie's hit the nail on the head. I mean, parts of this project do what single-family development can't do, which is cluster and thereby preserve a lot of sensitive wetland areas. But any part of this land that's buildable, which is the upland, is going to be blown to smithereens.
It's going to be what?
Blown to smithereens. Okay? And, in the process of doing that, it certainly isn't going to protect natural features, environmental values, and utilize the land in harmony, Section 8.2.1, number 2. The landscape is not going to be preserved in its natural state nor treated as fixed, as opposed to malleable, 8.1.16.1. The project does not minimize disturbances to the land. My God, it maximizes the disturbances to the land. It blows the hill up. The development pattern, is it going to adversely impact the natural landscape features, 8.124.2E? You bet it is. It's going to destroy them. Now,
Yeah,
in the
this-
end, we might decide that these features are not really, worth preserving. So maybe that's the reason that the bylaw wants us to identify them to begin with, so we can acknowledge, do we really want to preserve these? But it certainly isn't, preserving them. I think Marnie's word of imposed on the site is completely true. All right? You're just blowing this hill up, and then you're going to terrace it, and when in the end, it's going to look absolutely nothing like what was there. They say that they're going to keep a row of trees so we won't see it from 133, mature growth. As I think about how they're actually going to fit all the trucks in there and do all this blasting, I doubt it. What they're going to do is really take down almost all the trees and then replant them. But none of that is preserving what's there. It's
Yeah.
completely remaking everything
Emil,
from the ground up.
before you make your comment, I'd like to hear from Pat. I'd like to
Sure.
hear your views. We haven't heard much from you
No, that's all
during this
right. I'm usually
process,
just
so-
navigating the
You're usually
the thing in the background. I guess I've struggled with, so in The applicant's proposing to maximize the benefit of the site in the 50 units. And in their design, which allows them to maximize that benefit, they've done their best to try to minimize impact. I guess the question I challenge is whether or not it's, are we starting from the right premise? Like where okay, so here's a maximum benefit, 50 units, here's how you get that in there. And in doing that, in maximizing the benefit, I feel they've engineered the best way to do that. In all the evidence they've provided up until now, in the geotechnical, to the greatest extent possible, right? I mean, but again, the question is the site really meant to support the maximum benefit of the 50 units that's being proposed? I guess.
Yeah,
Well,
that's
I understand.
that's key. But
I don't know how to get. Yeah.
yeah, that's a very good question. I think we were sort of laying the groundwork. We're going to get to that because, again, at the basis of all this was stop sprawl 25 years ago. And sorry to be academic, but that was all good planning stuff that came around, and open space subdivisions was one of them that Randall Aaron started, and that cluster housing. But what has happened is that notion of cluster housing has been taken by some developers, not saying this one, and really through kind of a sense of green, it becomes sort of green clustering of buildings or greenwash. And we were going to get to the point where we're going to talk about, is this really cluster housing? Does this really comply with conservation subdivisions? But the big argument for me on this is, yes, it's construction, there's going to be damage. Okay. They're entitled to do what they want. But the issue is that what it comes down to when you take you got the 66 acres, take 10 out for the farmland, you wind up with 20-something acres that's outside the wetlands that's available as buffer area, and it's also other buildable land. So the argument that I think we're hearing from the applicant in this case was, well, we're giving you all this land, and we're just going to occupy part of it. But when they say occupy, they mean destroy it. And it doesn't say that anywhere in the bylaws. If you're really looking at word for word in the bylaws, it doesn't say you can do that. It says you build something that fits into the land, integrated with it. It doesn't mean you can't build on there. It says when you do anything, you do it that way. It tells you what to do. And it never says you can destroy it completely. And that's the whole notion of conservation subdivision. And if the town buys that sustainability, which it appears to have done, you need to be consistent in that policy going forward. And, that's the heart of this particular issue, I think. Because you cut right down to the major issue there.
Yeah.
Why can't they?
Well, then the follow-up question is that the decisions that were made with respect to the development of this site and basically the leveling of the top of the hill, but also the steep slopes, as Jonathan has often mentioned, have extreme ramifications for the stormwater management system and the erosion control systems that are in place. And I think that's really critical because the stormwater management system and these erosion control measures, they're not just there for the next 2 or 3, well, let's just say 2 or 3 years after the project were to be completed. They have to last in perpetuity. And that's a real issue on any number of levels. I mean, so we know that the stormwater management system has been peer-reviewed. The TEC consultants that the town engaged have said that this stormwater management system satisfies the requirements of Volume 1 of the stormwater management system. I think that's true. But I think that we really need to discuss this stormwater management system, its complexity, and also, and I think, Pat, at one point you mentioned this, and I know, Bill, you did too, the stormwater management regulations evolve with time. They're not static. And with climate change, it's important to get this right, because just because it works now doesn't mean it would work in the future. And of course, if there's failure at any level, it could have serious ramifications for the aquifer and whatnot. And we can talk about the hydrology and hydrogeology at a bit later. And clearly, we know that the GEI and GZA are in sync, that there's little to no risk to the aquifer if all goes well. So I'd like to, turn to the stormwater management aspect of this project now and get some input from people on that.
I'd just like to start with, Marnie, you said that they satisfied Volume 1, which is true, which is the BMPs. They've satisfied all the engineering calculations. All the peer reviewers said, yes, it's a robust system, and it satisfies the Volume 1 of the stormwater management guidelines. There's another volume, which is Volume 2. And Volume 2 is the qualitative part of it. And again, that's the part, plus the erosion and sediment control, that talks about the first steps and the first decisions of doing the design. And the peer reviewers are responsible for demonstrating that they've met the stormwater management calculation requirements in the BMPs, the best management practices. So that's once they've started the engineering calculations. That's what the peer reviewer does. What the peer reviewer does not do is look at the qualitative process of environmentally sensitive site design. That, again, goes back to 8.1.12 and all of the parallel requests in the stormwater management standards. So I would say a good question for the board is, what's the board's relationship to Volume 2 and all of the qualitative aspects of stormwater management standards as they are reflected in the state's bylaws, the local bylaws, and even the senior housing bylaw? So again, those are all the qualitative pieces of sensitive, environmentally sensitive site design, and we can get into the details of those, but they are very specific about what the goals are. And they don't just talk about protecting already protected conservation areas like wetlands and buffer zones.
Well, I'm curious as to whether the stormwater management system fully accounts for runoff from the site, and also about erosion and sediment control, because we do know that the applicant has taken significant steps to reduce the amount of impervious surfaces, and I believe that at least 1 acre has been added to surfaces that are not impervious. That was not a very articulate way of saying that the surfaces can now drain water. But with that said, I know that they are now also utilizing a lot of the crushed granite and armored slopes and that type of thing. So there are issues with respect to the maintenance of the stormwater management system over time, and the effectiveness and the aesthetic aspects of the armored slopes and the use of the crushed bedrock throughout this project.
So a question, Jonathan, are you indicating that both the applicant and the peer review are relying on faulty engineering and that they're not using best practices to control runoff here?
No, what I'm suggesting is that the stormwater management standards say specifically that you start with environmentally sensitive site design. That's your first priority. It actually says the first priority is environmentally sensitive site design. The second priority is to use best management practices, i.e. the calculations, pipes, catch basins, rain gardens. That's your second priority, but your first priority is environmentally sensitive site design, and that is delineated what that is. It's not vague, it's not...
So my question is, have they met the standards required to build this project?
They've met the BMP standards. Have they, if they've, my question to the board, and I have my own opinions about it, have they met the intent and standards in Volume 2? That's a different question than
Well,
have they met the BMPs?
I would venture that this board is not qualified to have any opinion on Volume 2 because we are not engineers, nor are we practicing, nor have we used any of that
I would
information.
disagree with that, actually. If you read Volume 2 carefully, it's
I'm not
actually
going
written
to
in
read
lay
Volume 2.
terms.
I
It's
have
written
to
in
deal-
very lay terms.
I have
Exactly.
to, we have to deal with the facts that are on the table, not what we wish they were. We have to hold them to a standard that exists now.
Rick, excuse me, that is a standard that exists now.
That's right, and our peer review said that they met that standard.
There's more to that standard than SIP.
Our peer reviewer said they met the standard. What, you
There are
can't,
multiple standards.
you
There's
can't,
not
no.
just
You can't start applying other standards that are not in place, that were not considered as part of this process and say, well, gee, they didn't consider those. That's not, you can't regulate with an eraser and a
There are-
pencil.
Excuse me, though, there are ramifications from the choices that get made, regardless of whether you like it or not. And one of those ramifications, and we, I would like to talk about it, is the maintenance and the costs associated with maintaining this stormwater management system and how effective that will be over time when none of us here are on the planning board and some of us are no longer even on planet Earth. So maybe in another form, like a coffin. So, we have to look to the future as to the efficaciousness of how this is designed, because just to say it's fine doesn't necessarily mean it will remain fine if there were other ways of addressing some of these issues. So I have other questions about whether, all the storm water is accounted for and whether there's other water on this site that needs to be addressed. And also, I would like to focus a bit on these erosion control measures in conjunction with the stormwater management.
Maybe we can, maybe,
You're asking, we're not capable of answering.
That's
We're
not,
here.
that's not true,
That's not true.
Richard. We were presented with significant amount of evidence with respect to all this information, and I read every bit of it. And, of course we can't be experts, but that's not to say that we can just say we defer to the experts. We're here to decide this issue. And the experts, they have addressed specific aspects of this project, but they have not looked at this project holistically. So
Yeah.
it's one thing to say the calculations are accurate, but if the resulting stormwater management system is really complex as a result of the design choices that are made, we have to consider that.
If they're, the experts, the engineers we're relying on for the information, we're not the experts. We're just evaluating information that were given to us. Shouldn't we take the opinions of the experts rather than making our own opinion?
No,
Why? How can,
We-
we're
no.
not qualified to.
you weren't listening to what Jonathan was saying.
you didn't
He-
listen to what I'm saying.
Maybe
the
you're not clearly expressing it.
I am telling you right
No, you're making it more complicated than it
I'm
is.
telling you right here and right now that the stormwater management system that was designed for this project is compliant with all the technical requirements set forth in Volume 1 of the Stormwater Management regulations. So all the calculations that have been used are accurate. Even Tom Hennigan didn't contest that because it has long-term ramifications because of the way this project is designed.
But did we ask for long-term solutions?
Of
Did
course.
we ask for the information for long-term?
Jonathan, I don't know if you
A
have,
planning board.
do you have, excuse
Well,
me,
I think that's a legitimate,
it's a legitimate
that's
question,
a
but
legitimate question.
nobody's listening to what was actually said unless I misunderstood. What Jonathan was saying, there are two volumes. One is technical, Volume 1. The other is Volume 2, which is design-oriented. That's what he's saying,
So-
and that's easy to understand if you read it.
That's fine. The
So
question is,
and the question was, you are required by the code to use both. You can approve it if they only resolve volume 1. You can approve it, but you do not have to. So the question is, are you going to apply both volume 1 and 2, as I understand it? And is that correct?
Okay, so that's fine. I get it now. Thank you for that clarification. So the question is, are we retroactively saying we're going to hold you to a higher standard that we didn't tell you in the beginning you had to meet?
The standard is in the book.
Okay, so my question is, have they met the minimum requirements for the development site that we're discussing, as approved by our peer reviewer?
If you accept
Yes or
volume
no?
2,
Yes
if
or
you
no?
don't accept it,
Yes or no?
then-
Just answer yes or no.
It's not a yes or no question.
Have they met the standards?
If you accept volume 2
Accept
as an
volume 2,
important
then they
piece,
haven't.
they have not.
They have
Right,
not.
and are they required to do that?
Yes, they are.
yes, they are.
So you mean to tell me that none of you on this board didn't tell them that they had to meet volume 2 and that Ransom Engineering didn't do that?
This board has had very little input in this process
Oh,
to date.
please.
So
Jonathan, of all
now we are here to
people-
deliberate. Now we are here to deliberate.
Yeah.
And
That's-
this is all in the bylaws. It's nothing hidden. It's in fact, it's so repetitive in the stormwater management bylaws that it's tedious. It's so repetitive, these principles.
This is where I'm confused, though. We had a peer reviewer who's looking at this, who does this professionally all the time for cities and towns around Massachusetts. They looked at what was presented, and they looked at the information that was presented and said, this met the standards, the statutory standards of what is required for stormwater management. So I'm confused as how we've leapt from, and I'm really seeking clarification here, we've leapt from what I understand to be that our peer reviewer said the stormwater management system as designed met all the requirements and criteria needed to function adequately for the runoff on this site. Am I wrong?
I think they looked at all the aspects of volume 1.
Okay.
We're not asked to review
So
anything else.
That would be the planning board's role, and here we are in
Right.
performing that role.
So, this is new information for me. So I'm just trying to get my hands around this new component piece of this, because I can't believe, I would have a hard time believing that the applicant wouldn't have caught that and said, well, the first thing the planning board's going to do is look at this and say, well, they didn't include volume 2 of the stormwater management requirements. So I'm having a hard time figuring out. If our peer reviewer said, yes, it meets the requirements, and now we're saying, well, they didn't consider volume 2, how do we bring that in now? And I'm not an engineer, so and you're asking me to consider that, and I would actually need some expertise to tell me, well, some of this applies, all of it applies, or none of it applies, and why? As opposed to board members who may have had experience with it but are not registered professional engineers who have a professional liability, and can lose their license by representing the information they're providing to tell me what in fact is the requirement. That's what I'm struggling with.
Again, what Emil pointed out is that you may approve a special permit for stormwater management if they satisfy all the BMPs. But the other component of it is that you don't have to if you find that the intent, the spirit intent of volume 2 was not followed. So that kind of sums it up right there. And
I'm going to say it's not his judgment to do that.
it's not the engineer's judgment
to the planning
exactly.
board to decide
It's the-
that.
So
That's the
And
issue.
in fact, Rick, if you recall, when we considered the stormwater management on Zero Bridge Street, we talked to the peer reviewer from Weston and Sampson, and he was flat-footed when, I think maybe it was Jonathan, who mentioned volume 2, and he said, I wasn't asked to look at that. The peer reviewer looked at the calculations, but let's move on, because we're not
I
going
think
to.
that, now I have a better understanding. So just a question, Jonathan, so I have a better, does volume 2 say, have that language, does it say that you should use this, may use this, or you may deny a stormwater because you haven't used it?
Let me just, I want to read one important piece of Volume 2. It's the first page, it's the introduction, and it's the 3 components of stormwater management. So I'm just going to excerpt this. To meet the stormwater management standards, a project proponent needs to consider the following 3 stormwater management components in this order of priority. 1, site planning. Design the development using environmentally sensitive site design and low-impact development techniques to preserve natural vegetation, minimize impervious surfaces, slow down times of concentration, and reduce runoff. That's the first priority. Second priority, source controls, pollution prevention, construction period erosion, and sediment control. Implement non-structural measures to prevent pollution or control it at its source. Non-structural is an interesting concept that I'd love to talk about more later. And then the third and last in the bottom of the priority is structural BMPs, and this is what the peer reviewers look at. Best management practice.
Okay.
And that is where the engineering calculations, way beyond anybody, unless there's a registered civil engineer in this group, way beyond the bandwidth of anybody in this group to peer review. So structural BMPs, design, construct, and maintain structural BMPs to attenuate peak flows, capture and treat runoff, and provide recharge to groundwater. That's where all the engineering calculations live. But again, they say in order of priority, the first step is the site planning. And that site planning, again, is those steps in 8.1.12.
Okay, so I get that. So help me understand how we use that site planning in the context of this discussion.
It's all in here. I can start reading stuff, and it's minimizing. I can rattle it off. Minimizing lawns, not change the direction of water, with pipes, not put it in pipes and basins. Keep it on the surface. It goes on and on and on. It's very specific and very layperson terms.
Might I chime in here? I've looked at a couple of these pages. I think that this site is so challenging that it would have been impossible for a developer to design 50 houses and put them on 10 acres on ledge, following these Volume 2 site design principles. I think when you're trying to do what this developer is doing, there's nothing you can do except pipes. You have to. This is rock, by God. And so the whole project is geared around doing whatever is technically feasible,
Right.
to get the water to where it's supposed to go,
Right.
even if that, is totally environmentally insensitive. It works from an engineering point of view, and that's what the project. That's all the project could do, given what it's trying to do.
Right.
This is a really, Patrick, I completely agree with you about this. Well, if we don't approve this, what are we up against? Maybe this is the best thing that could be done with the site. That's a calculation, a huge calculation. And of course, the plaintiff's attorney wants us to, go in fear, so to speak, that if we don't approve this, what we're going to do is get something much worse. And I don't know how to answer that.
No, I get it. I think we all agree that they had to use maximum engineering to make this site work.
I'd like to talk about that in a little more detail. There's a good discussion in there.
Yeah.
There's a good discussion in there. Shall I start?
I don't know where you're going, but.
Okay. So the applicant has on numerous times compared their work at Magnolia Shores. It's in the evidence package. They've compared their work at Magnolia Shores to this project, and they've said, we've done a lot of blasting here, we've integrated the buildings into the site, we can do this successfully, we can do this sensitively, look at how these buildings sit beautifully in the forest. And what's interesting is that if you look at that site plan for Magnolia Shores, which is readily available online, you can just go to the website, take a look at it. It's 50 acres with 44 units on a gently sloping site. It uses the exact same pattern of buildings, the same sort of design typology as 133 Essex, but you're talking about 44 units on 50 acres versus 50 units on 14 acres on a steep slope, surrounded by potentially sensitive areas, being vernal pools, wetlands, buffer zones, and a scenic road. So to compare these two projects and to use that typology, that building design of singles and pairs of basically single-family residences, separated from each other, it worked on Magnolia Shores in a completely different environment, wildly different environment. And to take that form and, to use the term that the bylaw says we shouldn't do, impose it on this site, I think is a choice, not a requirement. There were many other ways they could have designed this, many other ways. This is a developable site, I acknowledge that. But to take what worked at Magnolia Shores, and maybe that works as a sales model, maybe it works as a marketing model, but to take that and jam it into this site, I have some concerns about. And that's where I'm going with this.
So, that's
I would
great.
just-
So can you elucidate what your concerns are?
Yes. So, but I'd be happy if, I don't want to monopolize this conversation.
Going down this road, I want to know what they are.
Perfect. So, if you go through for example, the stormwater management state guidelines are amazingly accessible. Not the BMP calculations, but the principles are amazingly accessible. And they talk about minimizing disturbing steep slopes, and they define what the disturbance of a steep slope is. And they talk about trying to keep the water on the surface, not putting it in pipes. They talk about minimizing lawns. They talk about trying to use the natural hydrological systems. They talk about avoiding abrupt changes in direction of water flow. At the bottom of this hill, we have a pipe at the entrance of this property. There's a 15 or 13-inch pipe where the water has to reverse direction 180 degrees, and in a shallow culvert to not go into Tobacco Road. And if one catch basin behind, I forget what unit it is, there's one catch basin in the backyard of the east slope, if that's got 10 oak leaves on it, and then there's another shallow depression partway down the culvert by the cliff, if that's blocked up, it's only a 1 foot deep depression and a 90-degree change in direction of the pipe to get over to the first rain garden, the bottom rain garden. If either one of those things are overrun, that water's coming across Tobacco Road. So these are all principles that are outlined in the stormwater management guidelines as not good practice. Not good practice. On top of that, we have enormous number of 2-to-1 slopes, and I'm jumping ahead here, but these 2-to-1 slopes are either lawn or riprap. There's 1,650 square feet of riprap around the west and south slope of this thing. How that's going to be naturalized or behave properly, off into the future, I don't know. And then it's got crushed stone structural fill underneath it. All of these things are really poor practice to aim at a steep slope buffer zone and then a vernal pool or a wetland. None of these are good practice, and you heard it from your peer reviewers. There's too many 2-to-1 slopes. But yes, there was a robust stormwater management plan in place. You heard from the peer reviewer, the sidewalks are too steep. They exceed handicap ramp slopes. But the law says, yes, if you want to do that, you can do it. We have a certified letter from the architect saying, you may do that. Is it good practice? I don't think so. You have a lot of lawns that are actually unsafe to walk on, much less so steep that it's really difficult to even have a protection slope around a building. Anybody know what a protection slope around a building? Building code says you need a certain number of feet at a certain pitch around the building so the water goes away from the building. These 2-to-1 slopes are right hard against those protection slopes, forming literally a crease, and I've talked about this before, and that's unsustainable. It won't even stay put for a year. I've had 2 houses with those conditions, and you have to constantly dig out that slope because it's a fold in the topography. And the fines come down, fill that in, gradually the protection slope against the building reverses itself, and now you got a wet basement. It goes on and on and on. Everything is just jammed together, and you heard those words from Ransom. You know, everything is extreme. All the slopes are extreme, the transitions are extreme, and it's just not good practice. You didn't hear it from the peer reviewer doing stormwater management because they're in a little silo. They're asked to look at the BMPs and calculate whether the BMP meets the 80%, total suspended solids out of that system. Yes, it does, plus 10%. Great, check. That's in a little silo. It's not the big picture. Shall I stop there?
Pat Norton, what's your response? I mean, do you comprehend what Jonathan is saying? Do you have any comments with respect to that?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I've done a few stormwater management plans myself, and I do understand the basis from which they're peer reviewed also. And like many other engineering documents, none of them is really specifically written for any one particular, it's a lot of cut, paste, change name, apply standard. So I have some same concerns, and maybe to Bill Wheaton's, I guess the translation of what I was trying to say before wasn't the concern about whether or not if we don't approve this, what happens. It was more in context, if the basis from which we're reviewing this project is the 50-unit development, they've checked some boxes, I think, in the engineering effort on how to protect the local resource. But it is, right up at the extreme edges, all of them. So to the maximum extent possible for the 50 units to be developed on the site, I do think that some of those, if you translate it that way, a lot of those boxes do get checked. And that's just the concern, that's what I'm trying to work out, is the translation of what the basis from which they're allowed to do the thing. I think it hadn't started at the right point in the design intent as you apply it to the site. But
To me, if
that makes sense.
if the project ultimately gets approved, to me, the board then has to approve all the choices made by the developer.
Yeah.
You can't separate the two. So if you look back, again, back to 8112.
All right, give a mask. I don't know. I'm getting a little, I'm sorry, I'm freaking out.
No, I've got
Okay,
allergies.
okay, that's fine.
I would go back, when they first stepped foot on a site, they had to make a lot of choices, and the design team had to think about a lot of things. One is, how many buildings can we do? Well, we can do 50, that's allowable. Okay, done. Next choice is building type. And they said, well, our model is single-family house on flat ground.
Mm-hmm.
That's their model, that's what we do, that's what you have at Canterbrook, that's what you have in Magnolia. So let's do that here. Okay. So now you're launching this whole project in a direction, as Bill said, is it even going to be possible? So the first directive went out to Granite Engineering, make it work, fit them in there. And that's when they just started to discover a whole cascading series of problems, from my standpoint anyway, that they really made their life a lot more difficult. Now, can you build 50 units on that hillside? I think you can, but it wouldn't be with that typology, not a single-family house spread over 50 times on the site. You can get 50 units. That's not what they do, and it's not what they chose, and it's not for us to decide, make that decision. We're being asked to approve what they decided going down the line. Do we stand behind all of those choices? And that's, to me, what it comes down to.
That's a good way to describe it then, yeah.
Well, in this regard, I actually.
there's another way of
Sustainability is a real.
there's another way of looking at it, which is, if we don't approve this and they go ahead with some other plan and it has problems, at least our name isn't on it. I think that's what you're saying. Whereas if we approve it, in some sense, then we have approved their choices. And if we get into situations of, more climate change and more rain and the whole system doesn't work, then our name is on it. We approved it. I mean, I'm not sure they're legally were at fault, but the point is, do we want to do that? If we feel uncomfortable about the standards and how, the project is a little bit trying to squeeze a square piece of wood into a round hole, maybe we should let them try something else. At least we haven't approved it.
Well, we can only look at what we have in front of us, and, we can all wish for something else perhaps, but I think where Marty was just going to go, and I'll just mention sustainability. I think it comes down to how important are these things that are being given up in order to build this particular site, and all of that would be a lot of the natural features and the topography and so forth. And I have a lot more to say about some of the other issues around the particulars about the construction aspect of this, but
I'd like to talk just briefly about resiliency and maintenance, because it kind of goes to what Bill was just saying. If you look at the intent of most of the environmentally sensitive site design principles in the stormwater management standards, which is not just volume 2, but another very accessible volume is the sediment and erosion control. Very accessible, very easy to read, actually very educational. If you look at those, the thrust of them is to create resiliency and lower maintenance, not high maintenance, low resiliency, low redundancy. In other words, what you don't want is you don't want a high stakes
Poker game.
yes, a high stakes site plan. So, and because all of these things are pushed to their limit, very well engineered. My kudos to Granite Engineering. They pushed this thing to the limit, and they did a great job. But that's not what's on the table here. So, in my work, I've worked extensively and for many, many years helping folks like yacht clubs, private schools, beach clubs, condominium associations develop facilities management plans. I don't do it anymore. It's too frustrating. And the reason it's too frustrating is because if it's not pretty and it's not fun, they don't want to spend money on it. And to the point where literally they put blinders on if they possibly can. I'm dealing with a condominium association right now, which as a and I won't mention names here, but as a policy, they basically said, if it's not broken, we're not spending a dime on it. And they've done that for the last 25 years. And what's great is now they're about 20% below market rate, but what's horrible is their infrastructure is completely failed. And I don't do it anymore because it's too frustrating to do that.
Wind up with Florida.
I was going to say, are you located these clients in Florida?
Yes, so that's another similar example. To take another extreme example, I've dealt with, like a lot of yacht clubs, they're over water sheet on pilings, and I'd say, you need to inspect your pilings, you need to deal with it. No, we need a new carpet, we need some new petunias. And so finally, not a yacht club, but another building fell into Gloucester Harbor about 15 years ago. The entire building. They cut a gas pipe, a gas main. The gas main was preventing the building from toppling sideways. They cut the gas main. The entire building fell into Rocky Neck, the Rocky Neck area of the harbor.
Oh, yeah, I remember that, actually.
Yes. And after that, the city finally thought, ooh, we better police this a little harder. And now every 2 years, you have to have a certified engineer's report on your pilings. But nobody was going to do that unless forced. So what would be, I think, unfortunate for Hamilton to do is to set themselves up where they have high maintenance, low resiliency projects that need a lot of policing, a lot of maintenance, and failure intervention. That would be really unfortunate when Hamilton has their hands full with many other more important business.
Well, just to add to your point, I mean, this maintenance has to take place in perpetuity. It
Yes.
doesn't ever end.
No.
Number one. And number two, to just turn the onus on the town of Hamilton to police it is naive at best, because we don't have the capacity to do that. I mean, we're not a city. We don't have redundancy in our planning staff. Would you agree, Patrick? I mean, we don't have the personnel to actually, even if they were to submit reports, to review them timely. If after every 2 inches of rain, a rain garden or one of the stormwater management features has to be inspected, who inspects the condominium association to see if they're doing the proper inspections? I mean, do we now have to ensure that? And so that is exactly to your point, that it puts a real onus on the town, and to say, well, we could condition this on the applicant paying for all this stuff. Well, again, it's not a burden that the condominium association can ever shirk. It will always be there. So maybe we should, I think we've exhausted that to some extent. You did mention these armored slopes, and I do recall that if there are problems with that, I think it was Tom Hennigan who pointed out that to repair any of those features, it would potentially involve impact to the buffer areas, and I don't.
So I'd like to
That's
talk
my
about,
recollection.
I'd like to talk about something that sails right past stormwater management analysis, and that's hydrogeology.
Oh, good, because that was
okay.
on the
So,
agenda.
So stormwater management really focuses on what comes out of the sky.
You want to pause for a minute?
Oh, sorry. Yep, sorry, didn't notice.
Sorry, I don't want to miss the conversation.
Yep.
What's happening?
Richard walked away.
Okay, so shall I continue?
Can I just,
Sure.
as an introduction to the hydrogeology and hydrology, I'm sure you all are aware that Rick Frappa and Jamie Emery provided us with lengthy opinions as to the robustness and the effectiveness of the well testing that's in place for the blasting, and the number of test wells, and the applicant's agreement to test wells within 1,000 feet of the blast site. And both Rick Frappa and Jamie Emery were unequivocal that this site poses no threat whatsoever to the neighboring Beck Pond or the aquifer. And I think we need to consider that. But I commend the efforts to test the wells, and I think that we'll talk about the construction management plan later. But there are efforts to ensure that the effects of blasting do not have environmental ramifications. However, I do note that Jamie Emery's latest letter that he sent to the board did indicate that it was predicated on agreements that he had reached and written correspondence that he had exchanged with Rick Frappa of GEI. And I asked him point blank whether all the agreements were set forth in his most recent letter to the board, which I believe was July 16th, but someone could correct me if I'm wrong. And he said yes, except that there was one omission, and I think that the sense was it wasn't going to be addressed unless the project was approved. So I'm interested in the board's view of this and how it affects our decision. Anyone?
So, just to put a little context on stormwater management for just a second, it really focuses on what's coming out of the sky, landing on both impervious surfaces and, the lawns and roofs, and how to manage that surface water. What it doesn't really focus on is what's coming over the surface of the ledge and where that's going. That's hydrogeology. And so, Mr. Frappa's and Mr. Emery's contention was it was, small amounts, and they're really, the puzzle is that they were really concerned on the construction phase and the blasting plan, and there was really not much discussion about the long-term sort of pattern change of the way water moves. And it's just useful to have a little visualization of what the difference is. So if you think of there being kind of two drainage patterns over the hill, one is across the surface of the existing ledge, which then is changed when it's blasted, so now it's a different shape. So if you strip everything off that ledge, don't change it, that's one drainage pattern, then you blast it, that's a different drainage pattern. It's just a different shape. It's a different block. It's not a plateau with even sides, with even runoff on all sides. It's going to concentrate in some areas and be less concentrated in other areas. So that's the water running over the ledge. Then what's piled on top of that is structural fill, which is basically crushed stone, and that allows the water to run through faster than the original root mat and native soils. So the water's running faster over a different shape of ledge. And then it's landing in different places at different velocities and different volumes, and that's what Ransom was talking about. They basically said, well, wait a second, most of the water is now going over toward the entrance, toward the west slope and Tobacco Road. Is that good? Is it bad? We don't know, because there hasn't been a real study on it. So all of that water that's running over the ledge, anywhere coming down the hill, that isn't coming from the surface, is bypassing all the rain gardens. The rain gardens are about surface water. They're not about water running over that ledge. And again, to reiterate, what's on top of that ledge is quite a bit of structural fill, many feet of crushed stone. So that water's running at a greater rate of speed, depending upon the storm event, depending upon the season, in new directions. And then to get back to the question is, what does that mean? Nobody's really analyzed that, other than Mr. Emery and Mr. Frappa saying it's de minimis because the volume of water in Beck Pond compared to the amount of water coming down that hill is a tiny fraction in ratio. But that, that's one way to look at it, but it doesn't really look at the long-term incremental potential changes of the hydrogeology in the area. That's the question. That's why people have been asking for a hydrogeological study. It's what Dave Thompson was asking for. So with the armored bank, now you don't even have a grass surface. You just have tailings on top of crushed stone on a steep slope, aiming at another steep slope. And the question would be, and this was what I think Ransom was talking about, and the other peer reviewer might have even mentioned it, is if something goes wrong at the toe of that slope, it's hard to get there to fix it. And some of those interfaces are right against a buffer zone, or they're right against the property line, which is another subject we have yet to get to. the vegetated buffer around the perimeter of the site. But the issue is that you've got water running quickly over the ledge, quickly through the crushed stone, quickly through the tailings. That's maximum rate of speed of the water. And now it gets to the bottom of those tailings, and what it hits is it hits native soils, root mat, forest edge. So the water is going to abruptly slow down because it's a different environment. It's a totally different medium the water's running through. And the concern there is, will it break out? You know, will it hit? It's like hitting a dam. It's not a dam, but it's an abrupt slowdown of the water. If that breaks out there and there's erosion or sediment going into the buffer zone, there's really no way to deal with it. There's no way to get down there to deal with it. And those are, again, questions. And those were brought up, I think they were alluded to at various points.
I believe it was Tom Hennigan.
Yes. So and that's just more of an explanation of why that matters. Why does it matter that you should avoid steep slopes? Why does it matter that, you know, if you do mess with a steep slope, you know, what do you do to manage it? Do you terrace it? Do you revegetate it? You just pile riprap on it? Do you fill it with crushed stone? What do you do? And again, all of these strategies are at the bitter edge of good practice. They're not illegal, but they're at the very edge of good practice. So that's just a little bit of context around the armored banks. And again, I said there's about 1,600 linear feet of them, and some of them are 18 feet high. So
How visible, I mean, you obviously, you know, actually did a calculation and looked at that. How visible would those armored banks be to other
that's a really good
buyers of units and
really good question. The first, I mean, we're getting into a different subject, but if anybody remembers from the site walk, when you walk on the perimeter trail on the west side of the site, when you look up, that's a pretty open tree canopy. It's a pretty sparse tree canopy, and you can see the edge of disturbance flags on the stakes. You could see them during the site walk. I didn't take pictures of them, but I noted them. So that means that as you're walking the trail, you're looking up at that edge of disturbance, which is the bottom of the riprap, and those stakes are in full view. So that's one sort of item. Another item is if you go take a drive down Chewbacca Road and pause just before the edge of disturbance area, where they have a 2-to-1 slope filled with nursery stock right in front of the rain garden there. Just to the right of that, again, you can look up the slope and you can see the edge of disturbance stakes. Those are just single stakes with red flags on them. I have a photograph in my phone of them. So what that means is that when you replace that native forest with either a band of green embankment, you know, they're 2-to-1 embankments, which they have on the east side of the property, on the crater side, or the riprap on the west side, the precipice side, that is a very, very strong ribbon of single color, single texture. And that will be very prominently visible from Chewbacca Road before you get to their thicket of nursery stock on the 2-to-1 slope right in front of the rain garden. It'll also be visible when you hike the trails. So what you would see when you hike the trails is you'd see up to 18 feet vertical of riprap, and then you'd see the buildings perched on top of them. What that does to the natural sort of value of the trail system, yeah, that's something for the board to discuss. But you know, if you can see those stakes, you can see the ribbon of riprap. And once you have a uniform pattern of something, and I mentioned this in the Chewbacca Road analysis, take a drive down Chewbacca Road, look through the forest when you get out of Hamilton into Manchester, and take a look at the berm around the old landfill. So that's a uniform, probably about a 2-to-1 slope, couple trees on it here and there, mostly a grass slope. it stands in stark contrast to looking through the forest. So it's a strong visual feature visible through the forest. So that's what you'll get anytime you've got these steep slope embankments with grass or steep slope embankments with riprap. It'll be a strong visual feature. And it will not be invisible or hidden in the trees. So, did that answer your question?
It did. I'd like to turn to the discussion to the low-impact development techniques, because I believe that Granite Engineering attempted to improve this project, and I think to some extent they succeeded admirably by employing low-impact development techniques, and they reduce the width of the roadway, they reduce the amount of impervious surfaces and whatnot. And so, maybe, Emil, you could really talk a little bit, you probably have some experience, just for the benefit of the public, to just identify a couple of these low-impact development techniques. And then I think it would be nice to discuss, or appropriate to discuss, how these low-impact development techniques affect our review of this project.
I just want to add one, I'll do that, but I just want to add one thing to what Jonathan was just saying, because I was curious. I'm curious about the scale of this project, so I did look at that statement that they're going to keep 96,000 cubic yards of stone on the site and truck the rest away. And I was curious about that. What does that really translate into? And I went through the math on it to solve the problem. On a 14-acre site, what does that mean? How deep is that going to be on 14 acres? And it comes out 4 feet 3 inches deep across 14 acres. That is the gravel that's going to be there. That includes the steep slopes, it includes under the buildings, it includes everything. If you were to fill the entire site, I think the nature of that construction is that because of the type of house, it's going to be built on crushed gravel so that you have level footings, straight foundations, really inexpensive. They're not going to pin they're not going to pin the foundations or the footings to any rock there. It's too expensive, time consuming. So everything gets spread with gravel. Buildings go right on top of it, crushed or compacted a bit underneath the foundations. So essentially you have an open passageway under everything on the site, as far as we know. And as Jonathan said, you don't really know what direction it's going to take because nobody knows what that ledge looks like underneath, which direction it's going. And the issue, I was kind of curious when they went through that one discussion of all of a sudden they were trying to deal with contaminated stone, and James Emery said, we'll put it under slabs because it's protected from the rain. Rain is going to wash everything underneath
Underneath it.
underneath everything. So they finally came to a conclusion, yeah, that's not going to work. We can't really track where the contaminated stuff is, and so let's just wash everything. So, but the issue wasn't that. It's other pollutants that are going to go down in the ground and wash out, and as Jonathan was saying, they're all going to go downhill in
4 feet.
unprotected. 4 feet 3
For
inches.
14 acres.
Yeah, 14. So I just get a sense.
No, I
this-
understood the math.
the scale. So the low impact, I looked on the Massachusetts Smart Growth, Smart Energy Toolkit, Low Impact Development. This is state literature, not making it up. But site design practices, they had a couple of items to comply with low impact development matters. One is reduce storm pipes, curbs, and gutters. And again, I just took these directly off the list that they had. As been stated early, there's been a lot of reliance on basins and curbs to control surface runoff. That's part of that. But this is saying reduce storm pipes, curbs, and gutters, and what they're suggesting there is use natural hydrology whenever possible. It's not that you have to use it exclusively, but if you have the opportunity, use it because it has consequences. Number 2 is preserve sensitive soils. Well, my sense is after they get done blowing everything or blasting on top, there's not going to be any stockpile of any any useful soils, I think, on top of the hill. So they're going to have to truck in their topsoil, the 6 inches or whatever they're going to put on the top of it. But the preserve sensitive soils, no. Cluster buildings and reduce building footprints. It is a cluster, but they use the building type that just takes up the most area. It's a single-family house spread out. It's not a vertical building, it's a horizontal building. So they're not really, a cluster we'll talk about later, because is it a cluster or not? And reduce road widths, yes, they did do that. They reduced, and they also, in a positive sense, they changed their driveways to a pervious driveway. So they did, in a sense, as they got further into the project, they caught some things that they should be doing, and they did them. So they do deserve credit for that. So they did comply with that one. Minimize grading. That's been an issue, and you can't avoid it. The problem with steep slopes is you can fix it here. You're essentially moving the problem over here. It's like moving the blocks around on a site. You cannot solve a steep slope site just by blasting. They can create one level area, but they're going to make another area steeper. It's just part of the nature of what you're working with there. So minimizing grading and putting the safety aside for a minute. Limit lot disturbance is the next one. Well, I looked at their blast site, and it's pretty much over the entire 14 acres, or a large part of it, large section of it. So that reduce impervious surfaces. Again, they did that with the driveways, but the issue there is, when you look at, they say that there's 4.9 acres of impervious surfaces, roofs, roads, and so forth. So let's say it's 5 and it's a 14-acre site. That leaves 9 acres then of pervious material that's left on a site. But that's a very high percentage for a project, certainly on a conservation-type subdivision. It should be in the order of 15% maximum. They're up around between 25 and 30%. They would say, no, we're going to spread that over the whole site, let's look at the whole 66 acres, take away the farmland, take away the wetlands. So they essentially said, no, it's really, that's really, our construction is really,
It's a separate piece of land.
yeah, it's a separate piece of land, and it isn't that, is that what we're supposed to take away? You can do whatever you want as long as we're going to give you 25 acres of open space in perpetuity, and you can do whatever you want with the other space. Is that really what we're being asked to accept? And I think apparently it is, and so that's, those are really the key ones from the low impact development. I mean, there are things like rain gardens, which they are using, but that's more of a stormwater runoff. This low impact is really what you would do to utilize the natural site to a benefit of being low impact. So, Jonathan, I don't know if you have any other, or Pat, you might have some experience with this low impact development. So.
Yeah, I guess the question is it something utilized as a design intent, or is it something that was added after the fact as features to check a box, I guess is the question I have. Is the design basis incorporating
Yeah, it should be.
elements, or is it, again, with the driveways and whatnot?
What the literature says, it shouldn't be an afterthought. It should be part of the analysis, and that's kind of a critical thing. If you're going to take this route of sustainability and conservation subdivisions, you sort of have to adopt that strategy. You pull everybody together at the beginning. You don't do it in pieces, because everything is related, and everything has an impact eventually on the project. So that was some of the things that I picked up on that. I don't know if anybody has other comments on low impact.
No, and I think, we're almost at 10 o'clock. I just had really one more question, and that is whether we have any real understanding of the impacts of this development on the neighboring conservation areas, and in particular, Chabaco Woods. And those would be impacts from the clear cutting and the blasting and just the duration of the project over time. And of course, the town of Hamilton contributed to the purchase of Chabaco Woods. And so I think it's important that we understand how this project could affect the quiet enjoyment of the residents to Chabaco Woods, and also the impacts that might come about because of the development and the construction over time.
So do we want to get into neighborhood impacts right now, or
No,
should we try to finish up
I think
environmental
we should
and
just
site?
finish up, and that, you know, the answer to that question may be up in the air. Certainly, one could say that the residents, and not just from Hamilton, but from Wenham and Beverly, who enjoyed Chabaco Woods would most likely be very much aware of the construction, and I would assume that would be some impact to the animals there as well. So correct me if I'm wrong, but
Marnie, could I go back to, just to put a little bit more information into the site preparation and topography and sort of hydrogeology, and that is landscaping. Back to the crushed stone. You've got a big piece of ledge, we've got crushed stone on it, and then where there's lawn, there's 6 inches of loam proposed on top of the crushed stone. And then I would assume, there's no specification for it, but I would assume there'd be little pockets of loam where the trees and shrubs get planted. So, let's see, again, we've removed all the native soils, and we've put back the crushed stone on a well sort of drained hilltop, and we've removed.
Let me ask you a quick question.
Yeah.
Is this quarter-inch, half-inch tailings? What is, how stable, what's the granularity of the?
They haven't said how coarse it is, but it's probably
They're
like,
going to crush it, but usually it's 1.5 inches.
yeah.
Crushed stone under foundations and
Yep.
stuff.
So, but regardless, whether it's 3/4 inch, 1.5 inches, somewhere in that range, it might have some fines mixed in with it. Back to landscaping. So with the native soils, you have the benefit of sort of a community of trees. The last 20 years, there's been amazing inroads into understanding how trees behave as communities. The root system and the fungus actually allow the trees to share nutrients, even cross species, and there's even communication systems against pests. Anybody's welcome to read up about it, but it's sort of cutting edge research from the last 20 years. So that's how forests thrive and survive. So what we have instead is we have basically a mound of ledge, some crushed stone on it, according to Emil, on average 4 feet or so, 6 inches of loam on top of that, and a few loam pockets, and then we put trees on it. So
Do trees grow on crushed stone?
well, that's what I'm getting to. So, and the applicant has presented to us that in 6 years, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, any board member, in 6 years, we should have what essentially is kind of a mature forest as visible from the entrance. And when you combine the fact that we tend to have droughts and we tend to have hotter summers, and we're putting nursery stock that doesn't have any of the benefit of native soils or that root system that I was just talking about, and they're isolated in little loam pockets, and they're surrounded by an incredibly well-drained hilltop, so that water wants to run away real fast when you water one of these trees or shrubs. So what I would say is that as ambitious as those renderings show for that to be a mature forest in 6 years, I would say that just from a technical point of view, in terms of landscape design, what those trees are being planted on and what the subsurface behavior is going to be, I'd say that's a tad optimistic. That's all I want to say about that.
Wait. Are you implying that in X period of time, they're all going to be dead?
I didn't say they'd be dead, but to expect to see a mature forest from nursery stock in 6 years on a well-drained, crushed stone-covered hilltop is optimistic.
Yeah, I'd assume that, yeah.
Well, I think, let's see here, it's 5 minutes of 10, and I think this is an appropriate place to stop. I think this has been a really good discussion, and then at the next meeting, I'm hoping that we can make a little more progress. Maybe the topics are maybe not, to use Rick's word, quite as academic, and we can make a little bit more progress. I would hesitate to predict that we would get to the end of our deliberations, but we'll leave that open-ended at this point. I will say that if any board members have questions that they'd like discussed, or topics that, to be added to our list of topics, you could communicate those questions or topics to Patrick, and I could take note of them, and we can discuss that at a future date.
And people need to sign that. Sign
It's
the.
done. It's done.
Oh, it's done?
It's done.
Oh,
We
good.
did it during the breaks.
Need me.
Missed it,
Who's
missed
the
it.
bottom signature here?
I signed it. I think I was fourth. Wheaton?
Who's got this little squiggle thing on the bottom?
It's me.
And you're 5.
You might want to do a whole signature. I don't mean to be rude.
At any rate, at this juncture, I will entertain a motion to adjourn, or actually, as first, I'll entertain a motion to continue our deliberations to August 30th at 7 p.m. Now, is anyone interested in meeting earlier than 7 p.m.? If there's any, no, okay. So I will
I'll make a
entertain,
motion that we continue this meeting till, what's the date?
August 30th.
August 30th at 7 PM?
Do I have a second?
Are we meeting virtually or in the same format, Pat?
I think that we could meet,
In
do you
per-
find it helpful to meet in person? I do. Or not?
Yeah.
I like it.
I prefer it.
So if we're,
Oh. I'll second the motion. I don't know if Ms. Stein has a comment to make on this.
Well, I just wanted to remind you to discuss the location part of it.
right, so,
Remind folks to check the
right.
agenda in advance for final confirmation.
right,
And then it'll be a hybrid meeting.
right, right. So when I call your name, you can indicate whether you agree with the motion to adjourn. I don't anticipate any.
Actually, I make the motion to adjourn. So-
Second.
And Rick
Second, okay.
seconded, yes. So
Needs to be as all in favor.
can we do all in favor since we're all together?
Yeah, but for the
Benefit of the public,
it doesn't hurt to
it doesn't hurt.
maintain the
So when I call your name, please say aye. Rick Mitchell,
Rick Mitchell, aye.
Richard Boroff,
Richard Boroff, aye.
Bill Wheaton,
Bill Wheaton, aye.
Jonathan Poor,
Jonathan Poor, aye.
Emil Dahlquist,
Emil Dahlquist, aye.
Pat Norton,
Pat Norton, aye.
and Marnie Crouch, aye. So we'll meet again on August 30th. And hopefully at that point, we will have plenty of rainwater.
Yeah,
Plenty
let's
of
hope
what?
so.
Oh,
Rainwater.
yeah.
Rain.
Tomorrow, maybe, yeah?
Kim's already letting us to pack rain jackets for kids.
Meeting.
So we've adjourned, now we have to, well, we've continued the hearing, we have to adjourn.
Oh.
Do I have a motion to adjourn?
Motion made to adjourn?
Second?
Too bad.
Well,
We closed the hearing.
I thought it was a motion to adjourn, wasn't it?
it was a motion to continue.
That's what
No,
we
but
heard.
I thought there
We
were
already
two.
Oh, there were two, I'm
We
sorry.
already voted
Oh,
on
did
it.
We
get
made
two?
a
already
motion to
voted to adjourn.
continue, and that was
Voted to
approved. We did not make a motion to adjourn. I made the motion just now to adjourn.
I think there was a motion.
I second it.
Continue.
Yeah, but no one's here to hear it.
That's okay. Keep going.
All in favor? Aye. since,
Aye.
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 Yeah. You don't-